this complete journey through the Old Testament, you will see how one promise survived a lost garden, a global flood, slavery, war, divided kingdoms, and exile, and why the entire story ends waiting for a king. Before there was a nation called Israel, before Moses stood before Pharaoh, before David ruled from Jerusalem, and before the prophets spoke of a coming Messiah, the biblical story began in a world without war, exile, temples, or kings. It began with creation. But the first pages of the Old Testament do more than explain how the world began. They introduce the questions that will shape everything that follows. Why was humanity created? What went wrong? Why does violence spread from one generation to another? And how can the purpose of God continue through people who repeatedly reject His ways? The Old Testament will carry these questions through families, nations, covenants, battles, kingdoms, and exile. Yet every major conflict in that long history can be traced back to the opening chapters of Genesis. The story begins with God, not humanity. Before the first city rose, before the first altar was built, and before the first human voice spoke, God created the heavens and the earth. Genesis presents creation not as a struggle between competing gods, but as the deliberate work of one sovereign creator. Light appears at His command. Waters are separated. Dry land emerges. Vegetation covers the earth. The sun, moon, and stars mark days and seasons. The seas fill with life, and living creatures move across the land. The world takes shape with order, purpose, and distinction. Again and again, creation is declared good. Then the narrative slows. Humanity is created in the image of God. This description gives human beings a unique place within creation. They are part of the earth, formed from what God has made. Yet they are also appointed to represent His rule within the world. Male and female are given dignity, responsibility, and a shared calling. They are commanded to multiply, fill the earth, and exercise stewardship over living creation. The biblical story, therefore, begins not with humanity searching for purpose, but with purpose already given. Human beings are created to live in relationship with God, with one another, and with the world entrusted to them. Genesis describes a garden planted in Eden, a place of provision, beauty, and divine presence. The man is placed there to work it and guard it. Every tree pleasing to the eye and suitable for food is available to him, including the tree of life. But one boundary is established. The man must not eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. The command is not presented as a test of intelligence, it is a test of trust. Will humanity receive wisdom and moral order from the Creator, or will humanity attempt to define good and evil independently? God then declares that it is not good for the man to be alone. Animals are brought before him, but none corresponds to him as an equal partner. The woman is then formed, and the man recognizes her as one who shares his own humanity. Their union establishes the first human family. There is no shame between them, no rivalry separates them, no fear disturbs their relationship with God. The world of Genesis begins in harmony. But that harmony will not last. A serpent enters the story. Genesis describes the serpent as more crafty than the other creatures. Instead of beginning with a direct denial of God, the serpent begins with a question. The command is distorted. God's generosity is made to appear restrictive. The boundary given for humanity's protection is recast as evidence that God is withholding something desirable. The woman explains that they may eat from the trees of the garden, but not from the forbidden tree. The serpent then contradicts the warning of death and suggests that eating the fruit will open their eyes and make them like God, knowing good and evil. The temptation reaches beyond appetite. The woman sees that the tree is good for food, pleasing to the eyes, and desirable for gaining wisdom. She takes the fruit and eats. She gives some to her husband who is with her, and he eats as well. The act itself is brief. its consequences will fill the rest of Scripture. Their eyes are opened, but not in the way the promise implied. Their first discovery is not freedom power or enlightenment, it is shame. They recognize their nakedness and attempt to cover themselves. When they hear God in the garden, they hide. For the first time, human beings retreat from the one whose presence had given them life. God calls to the man, asking where he is. The question is not evidence that God has lost track of him. It draws the man out of hiding and forces the rupture into the open. The man admits that he was afraid because he was naked. When confronted, he does not simply confess. He points to the woman and even refers to her as the woman God gave him. The woman points to the serpent. The pattern has already begun. Rebellion, shame, fear, hiding, and blame. God announces consequences for each participant. The serpent is cursed and brought low. Hostility will exist between the serpent and the woman, and between their offspring. Genesis then gives a mysterious promise. The woman's offspring will strike the serpent's head, though the serpent will strike his heel. At this early point, the text does not explain every dimension of that promise, but it establishes a conflict that will continue beyond Eden. Evil will wound humanity, yet it will not have the final word. Across the Old Testament, the hope of victory will gradually become connected with a promised descendant, a righteous king, and an anointed deliverer. The woman will experience pain in childbirth and conflict within the human relationship. The man will struggle against a ground now marked by thorns and resistance. Work itself is not the curse, because humanity worked before the fall. But labor will now be frustrated, exhausting, and tied to survival. Death enters human experience with terrible certainty. The man came from the dust, and to the dust he will return. Yet even in judgment, mercy is visible. God provides garments for the man and woman. Their own attempt to cover their shame is replaced by a covering they did not make for themselves. Then they are sent out of Eden. Access to the tree of life is guarded. Humanity cannot seize immortality while remaining in rebellion. The way back is closed, and life outside the garden begins. This is the first exile in the Bible. Later, Israel will be driven from its land because of covenant unfaithfulness. Jerusalem will fall. The people will be taken to Babylon. But long before those national tragedies, humanity itself is expelled from sacred space. The pattern is already established. God gives a place of blessing. Humanity rebels, judgment follows, and exile becomes the consequence. Still, the story does not end outside Eden. The first man is named Adam, and he names his wife Eve because she will become the mother of the living. Their family begins, and with it comes the first evidence that sin has not remained contained within one act. Eve gives birth to Cain, and later to his brother Abel. Cain works the ground, Abel keeps flocks. In time, both brothers bring offerings to God. Abel brings from the firstborn of his flock, while Cain brings produce from the soil. God regards Abel and his offering favorably, but Cain and his offering are not regarded in the same way. Genesis does not explain every detail behind this distinction. Later scripture emphasizes Abel's faith and the righteousness associated with his offering. What Genesis makes unmistakably clear is Cain's reaction. He becomes angry and his face falls. God warns him before the violence occurs. Cain is told that if he does what is right, he will be accepted. But if he does not sin, is crouching at the door. It desires to control him, but he must rule over it. This is a moment of decision. Sin is no longer presented only as a broken command in a garden. It is pictured as a predatory force waiting at the threshold of the human heart. Cain does not master it. He leads Abel into the field and kills him. The first death recorded after Eden is not caused by old age or disease. It is murder between brothers. When God asks Cain where Abel is, Cain answers with defiance. He claims not to know, and asks whether he is responsible for watching over his brother. But Abel's blood cries out from the ground. The earth that Cain cultivated has now received the blood of the innocent. Cain is judged, and the ground will no longer yield its strength to him. He will become a restless wanderer. Cain fears that someone will kill him, yet God places a sign of protection upon him. Judgment does not disappear, but immediate vengeance is restrained. Cain then goes away from the presence of God and settles in the land of Nod, east of Eden. The direction matters. Humanity is moving farther from the garden. Cain builds a city and names it after his son. Civilization begins to develop. Generations arise. Music, livestock management, and metalworking appear among Cain's descendants. Human creativity continues because the image of God has not been erased. But so does human violence. One descendant, Lamech, boasts to his wives that he has killed a man for wounding him. Cain feared vengeance 7 times over. Lamech celebrates vengeance multiplied far beyond measure. Sin is no longer merely defended, it is praised. The progress of civilization has not produced moral restoration. Cities can be built while the human heart remains corrupted. Tools can become more sophisticated while violence becomes more deeply rooted. Yet Genesis follows another family line as well. Adam and Eve have another son named Seth. Eve recognizes him as another offspring given after Abel's death. Through Seth's line, people begin to call on the name of the Lord. 2 trajectories now unfold side by side. One line is marked by escalating violence and self-glorification. The other preserves worship, remembrance, and hope. But the division is not as simple as one family being perfect and the other entirely corrupt. All humanity now lives east of Eden. All share the condition introduced by Adam's rebellion. Death moves through every generation. Genesis records a long genealogy from Adam through Seth. The repeated pattern is sobering. A man lives, fathers children, continues for many years, and then dies. Names change, generations pass, but the sentence spoken in Eden remains. And he died, and he died, and he died. The genealogy is not merely a list, it is a record of death's reign. Still, one figure interrupts the pattern. Enoch walks with God, and then he is no more because God takes him. The text gives few details, but his life becomes a sign that fellowship with God is still possible in a world under death. Later, another man is born, whose father hopes he may bring relief from the painful labor of the ground. His name is Noah. The name is associated with rest or comfort. His arrival creates a quiet expectation. Could this child bring relief from the curse? Could the human story finally turn toward restoration? But as Noah grows, the world around him grows darker. Genesis describes a period when the human population increases and the boundaries between what God intended and what humanity desires become increasingly distorted. The passage concerning the sons of God, the daughters of humanity, and the Nephilim has produced many interpretations. The text does not provide enough information to settle every question with certainty. Its central point, however, is clear. Humanity has become deeply corrupt. Power is being abused. Desire is unconstrained. Violence fills the earth. God sees that human wickedness is great and that the inclination of the human heart continually turns toward evil. The language is comprehensive. The problem is not limited to isolated criminals or a single violent family. Corruption has spread through the human world. The earth, created as good, is now filled with violence. Human beings appointed to care for creation have become agents of destruction within it. Genesis describes God as grieved by what humanity has become. This does not mean the rebellion surprised him. or that he lacked knowledge of the future. The language reveals the real moral weight of human evil. Violence is not treated as a minor flaw in an otherwise successful civilization. It is an assault upon the purpose for which humanity was created. Judgment is approaching. God declares that he will bring an end to the corrupted order that has filled the earth. The world outside Eden has reached another point of no return, but one sentence prevents the story from closing in total destruction. Noah finds favor in the eyes of the Lord. He is described as a righteous man in his generation, one who walks with God. This does not present Noah as sinless. It identifies him as a man whose life stands in contrast to the violence surrounding him. Then God speaks to Noah. The earth is filled with violence. The end of all flesh has come before him. A flood will be brought upon the world, and Noah is commanded to build an ark. The warning is unlike anything humanity has heard before. The project will demand trust before there is visible evidence. Noah must prepare for judgment while the world around him continues as if nothing will change. Creation began with waters being separated and boundaries being established. Now those boundaries are about to collapse. The world formed in order is moving toward the waters of judgment. Yet inside that coming catastrophe, God is preparing preservation, a family, a vessel, and the continuation of a promise that human rebellion has not been able to destroy. The door of Eden had closed behind Adam and Eve. Now another door would soon be built, and through it the future of humanity would have to pass. Noah had been warned that judgment was coming, but the warning was not given without a way of preservation. God commanded him to build an ark, a vast wooden vessel large enough for his family, provisions, and representatives of the living creatures that moved across the land. The dimensions were precise. The structure was to be covered inside and outside, divided into compartments, and built with an opening for light and a door in its side. Nothing in the text suggests that Noah negotiated with God. He obeyed. This obedience would define his role in the story. Noah could not stop the corruption of his generation. He could not reverse the violence that filled the earth. But he could trust the word of God before judgment became visible. God declared that he would establish a covenant with Noah. His wife, his sons, and their wives would enter the ark with him. Animals would also be brought in so that life would continue after the waters receded. The ark was not an escape designed by human wisdom. It was a means of preservation provided by God. Then the time came. Noah entered the ark with his household. The animals came according to their kinds. Food had been stored. The door was closed. Genesis says that God shut Noah in. Outside, the world continued beneath the same sky it had always known. Cities still stood. Families still ate, worked, and slept. The ground appeared stable. The seas remained within their boundaries. Then the rain began. The fountains of the great deep burst open, and the floodgates of the heavens were opened. Water came from above and below. The ordered boundaries established in creation seemed to collapse. For 40 days and 40 nights, rain fell upon the earth. The waters rose. The ark lifted from the ground and began to move upon the surface. Hills disappeared. Mountains were covered. Every place that had represented human strength was swallowed beneath the flood. The world of violence was brought under judgment. Genesis does not describe the flood as an uncontrolled force beyond God's authority. The waters rise according to his declaration, and they will later recede according to his command. Judgment is severe, but it is not chaotic in the sense of being outside divine rule. Inside the ark, Noah and his family waited. The text gives almost no description of their daily experience. We are not told how the animals were arranged, in every detail how the family divided its work, or what thoughts passed through their minds as the ark moved above a drowned world. Those details remain unknown. What Scripture emphasizes is that God remembered Noah. This does not mean that Noah had been forgotten and then suddenly returned to God's attention. In biblical language, when God remembers, He acts faithfully toward a covenant or promise. A wind passed over the earth. The waters began to subside. The springs of the deep and the floodgates of heaven were closed. Rain stopped. Slowly the flood retreated. The ark came to rest on the mountains of Ararat. But resting on a mountain was not the same as being able to leave. Noah waited. As the waters continued to decrease, mountain peaks appeared. He sent out a raven and later a dove. The dove initially found no resting place and returned. 7 days later, Noah sent it again. This time it came back carrying a freshly plucked olive leaf. Life was returning. The earth was becoming habitable once more. After another period of waiting, the dove was set out and did not return. Eventually, God commanded Noah and his household to leave the ark. They stepped out into a world both familiar and transformed. The soil remained. The sky stretched above them. Animals moved again across the land. Yet the people and places of the old world were gone. Noah's first recorded act after leaving the ark was not to build a house or establish a city. He built an altar. He offered sacrifices to God, acknowledging that survival had not come through human power alone. The narrative moves immediately from preservation to worship. God then made a commitment concerning the earth. Though the inclination of the human heart remained corrupted, He would not again destroy all living creatures by a flood. Seed time and harvest, cold and heat, summer and winter, day and night would continue. This statement is important because the flood had judged human violence, but it had not removed sin from the human heart. The world had been washed by water. Human nature had not been recreated. God blessed Noah and his sons, repeating the command once given to the first humans, "Be fruitful, multiply, and fill the earth." Humanity was being given another beginning. But this beginning was not Eden restored. The relationship between humans and animals would now be marked by fear. Human beings were permitted to eat meat, though they were forbidden to consume blood because blood represented life. The sanctity of human life was strongly reaffirmed. Whoever shed human blood would be held accountable because humanity was made in the image of God. Even after the fall, even after generations of corruption, and even after the flood, the image of God still gave human life unique dignity. Then God established His covenant not only with Noah, but with his descendants and with every living creature. The sign of that covenant was the rainbow in the clouds. Whenever the bow appeared, it would testify that the waters would never again become a flood to destroy all flesh. The rainbow was not a human promise to behave better. It was a divine promise of restraint and preservation. The future of the biblical story would unfold under that mercy. Noah's family now stood at the beginning of a new age. His sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, would become ancestors of peoples who spread across the earth. But almost immediately, the weakness of the human heart appeared again. Noah planted a vineyard. He drank its wine and became drunk and lay uncovered inside his tent. Ham saw his father's condition and told his brothers. Shem and Japheth responded differently. Walking backward so that they would not gaze upon Noah's nakedness, they covered him with a garment. When Noah awoke and learned what had happened, he pronounced words concerning the future of his family lines. Canaan, the son of Ham, was placed under a curse, while blessing was associated with Shem and enlargement with Japheth. This passage has often been misused to justify racial prejudice and oppression. The text does not support those distortions. The curse is directed toward Canaan, not toward every descendant of Ham. And it cannot legitimately be turned into a biblical defense of racial hierarchy. Within Genesis, the episode reveals something more immediate. The flood has ended, but shame, dishonor, and fractured family relationships have returned. Noah had walked faithfully with God in a violent generation, yet Scripture does not present him as flawless. The biblical story refuses to hide the failures of its central figures. The future cannot depend upon the perfection of Noah or his sons. Generations increase, and the descendants of Noah spread into different regions. Genesis presents a table of nations tracing peoples through the family lines of Shem, Ham, and Japheth. These genealogies are more than names. They establish the world in which the later biblical story will unfold. Egypt, Canaan, Assyria, and other nations that will later interact with Israel are placed within the same human family. Israel's future enemies are not different kinds of beings. They share the same post-flood ancestry. The nations are connected. Humanity has one origin, one dignity, and one shared problem. Among the descendants listed is Nimrod, described as a mighty figure and associated with early centers of power, including Babel in the land of Shinar. There the narrative pauses over another defining event. Humanity still shared one language. As people moved eastward, they settled on a plain in Shinar. They learned to make bricks and harden them with fire. Instead of stone, they used manufactured building material. Instead of mortar, they used bitumen. Their technology allowed them to build on a scale that would have been difficult before. They said to one another that they would construct a city and a tower whose top would reach toward the heavens. They would make a name for themselves and prevent themselves from being scattered across the earth. The problem was not architecture alone. Cities and towers are not condemned simply because they are large. The deeper issue lies in the motive. God had commanded humanity to fill the earth. The builders wanted to remain gathered in one place. Humanity had been created to bear God's image. The builders wanted to make a name for themselves. The tower represented organized human power, attempting to secure identity, unity, and permanence without submission to the Creator. It was civilization turned inward. The language of Genesis is almost ironic. The builders intend to construct a tower reaching the heavens, yet God must come down to see it. What seems immense from the ground remains small before the Creator. God observes that humanity's shared language and unified purpose will enable their rebellion to expand. He confuses their speech so that they can no longer understand one another. The project stops. The people scatter. The city becomes known as Babel, associated in the narrative with confusion. Human beings feared scattering, yet scattering is exactly what occurred. They tried to create unity without obedience, and their unity fractured. They attempted to make their own name, but Babel became a lasting name for confusion and pride. The story of the nations now appears to have reached another dead end. Eden had ended in exile. The generations before the flood had ended in judgment. The post-flood world had now organized itself around pride and resistance. Yet God did not respond by abandoning his purpose. Instead, Genesis shifts its attention once again. The camera of the biblical story moves away from empires, towers, and famous cities. It follows the line of Shem through generations of people whose names would have seemed insignificant beside the rulers of the ancient world. Then one family appears. Terah became the father of Abram, Nahor, and Haran. Haran became the father of Lot, but died in Ur of the Chaldeans while his father was still alive. Abram married Sarai, and Nahor married Milcah. Genesis then gives a painful detail. Sarai was unable to have children. This fact will shape everything that follows. Terah took Abram, Sarai, and Lot and left Ur, intending to travel toward the land of Canaan. They reached Haran and settled there. Terah eventually died in Haran. The family had begun a journey, but had not reached its intended destination. Then God spoke to Abram. The command was costly. Abram was told to leave his country, his relatives, and his father's household and go to a land God would show him. In the ancient world, land, extended family, and household were central sources of security and identity. Abram was not being asked to make a brief journey and then return. He was being called to release the structures that defined his past and trust a destination he had not yet seen. But the command came with a promise. God would make Abram into a great nation. He would bless him. He would make Abram's name great. Abram would become a blessing. Those who blessed him would be blessed, and those who treated him with contempt would come under judgment. Then came the promise that gave Abram's calling significance far beyond his own household. Through him, all the families of the earth would be blessed. This is God's answer to the world of Babel. At Babel, humanity attempted to make its own name. God promised to make Abram's name great. At Babel, the nations united in self-exaltation. Through Abram, God intended to bring blessing to the nations. At Babel, humanity resisted being scattered. Through Abram's descendants, God's purpose would eventually reach far beyond one land and one family. The promise did not deny the judgment that had come before it. It introduced a new stage of redemption within a world still marked by sin. Abram departed as God had instructed him. He was 75 years old when he left Haran. Sarai went with him along with Lot, their possessions, and the people connected with their household. They traveled toward Canaan. The journey led them through the land to the area of Shechem, near the great tree of Moreh. Canaanites were already living there. Abram had reached the land God had indicated, but he did not possess it. Then God appeared to him and promised that the land would be given to his offspring. The promise immediately created a tension. Sarai had no child. The land was occupied. Abram was a wandering outsider. Everything God promised appeared larger than Abram's circumstances. Abram built an altar. He moved from place to place, pitched his tent, and called on the name of the Lord. The man summoned away from his homeland now lived between altars and tents, worshiping the God who had called him, while waiting for promises not yet fulfilled. But faith did not remove difficulty. A severe famine struck the land. Abram had only recently arrived in the place of promise, yet the land could not sustain him. He traveled south toward Egypt to live there temporarily. As he approached Egypt, fear began to shape his decisions. Sarai was beautiful, and Abram feared that Egyptian men would kill him in order to take her. He instructed her to say that she was his sister so that he might be treated well because of her. The statement contained part of the truth, but it was designed to conceal their marriage and protect Abram at Sarai's expense. Pharaoh's officials saw Sarai and praised her to Pharaoh. She was taken into Pharaoh's household, while Abram received livestock and servants. The man called to become a blessing to the nations had entered Egypt through deception. The promise seemed endangered before Abram's journey had barely begun. But God intervened. Pharaoh's household was struck with severe afflictions. Pharaoh confronted Abram, demanding to know why he had concealed that Sarai was his wife. Sarai was returned, and Abram was sent away with his possessions. The irony is sharp. The pagan ruler rebuked the man of promise for failing to speak openly. Abram left Egypt alive and wealthy, but not because his plan had been righteous. The promise survived because God remained faithful even when Abram acted from fear. This pattern will appear repeatedly throughout the Old Testament. God's chosen people will sometimes display faith, and at other times they will compromise, deceive, rebel, or retreat. The biblical story will not move forward because its human participants are consistently strong. It will move forward because God remains committed to his purpose. Abram returned to the land and traveled again to the place where he had built an altar. Lot was still with him, and both men possessed large herds and households. Their prosperity created a new conflict. The land could not support them together, and their herdsmen began to quarrel. Canaanites and Perizzites were also living in the region, making resources even more contested. Abram proposed separation. He allowed Lot to choose first. Lot looked toward the well-watered plain of the Jordan, a region that appeared fertile and desirable. He selected the area near the cities of the plain and moved his tents toward Sodom. The narrator immediately warns that the people of Sodom were deeply wicked. Lot chose according to what his eyes could see. Abram remained in Canaan. After Lot departed, God told Abram to look in every direction. All the land before him would one day belong to him and his descendants. His offspring would become as numerous as the dust of the earth. Again, the promise was vast. Again, Abram remained childless. He moved to the oaks of Mamre near Hebron and built another altar. The land had been promised. The nations were meant to be blessed. A great people was supposed to emerge. But Abram and Sarai still had no son. And as years began to pass, the question grew more urgent. How could one childless couple become the beginning of a nation through whom the entire world would be blessed? Abram had received promises of land, descendants, and blessing, yet he and Sarai remained childless. Years passed. The promise did not change, but Abram's circumstances did not seem to move any closer to its fulfillment. The longer he waited, the more impossible the future appeared. During this period, conflict in the region drew Abram into war. A coalition of eastern kings defeated the cities of the Jordan plain and carried away people and possessions, including Lot, who had been living near Sodom. When Abram heard that his nephew had been captured, he gathered the trained men of his household and pursued the invading forces. He defeated them, rescued Lot, and recovered the people and goods that had been taken. On his return, Abram was met by two kings whose responses could not have been more different. The king of Sodom offered Abram the recovered possessions, asking only for the return of the people. Abram refused to enrich himself through Sodom, declaring that no one should be able to say that the city had made him wealthy. But another king appeared, Melchizedek, king of Salem and priest of God Most High. Melchizedek brought bread and wine and blessed Abram in the name of the Creator of heaven and earth. Abram gave him a tenth of everything. Genesis gives no genealogy or extended background for Melchizedek. He enters briefly as both king and priest, blesses Abram, and then disappears from the immediate narrative. Centuries later, Psalm 110 and the New Testament book of Hebrews would return to his significance. At this stage, however, the scene confirms that the God who called Abram was not confined to Abram's household. He was God Most High, creator of heaven and earth. After these events, God spoke to Abram in a vision. Abram was told not to fear. God would be his shield and his very great reward. But Abram responded with the question that had grown more painful with time. What could God give him when he still had no child, as things stood? A servant born in his household appeared likely to become his heir. God rejected that conclusion. Abram's heir would come from his own body. Then God brought him outside and directed his attention toward the night sky. Abram was told to count the stars if he could. So would his offspring be. Abram believed God, and his faith was counted to him as righteousness. This does not mean Abram understood how every promise would be fulfilled. It means he trusted the one who made the promise, even when the path remained hidden. God also reaffirmed the promise of the land. Abram asked how he could know that he would possess it, and God established a covenant through a solemn ancient ceremony. Animals were divided, creating a path between the pieces. Normally, those making such a covenant would pass between them, symbolically accepting the fate of the animals if they broke their word. But Abram fell into a deep sleep. A dreadful darkness came over him. God revealed that Abram's descendants would live as foreigners in a land not their own. They would be oppressed for 400 years, but God would judge the nation that enslaved them and bring them out with great possessions. The promise would pass through suffering before fulfillment. Abram himself would die in peace, but his descendants would return to the land in a later generation. Then a smoking firepot and a flaming torch passed between the pieces. Abram did not walk through them. God alone passed through the covenant path. The future of the promise rested ultimately upon God's faithfulness. Yet Abram and Sarai still had to live through the waiting. Sarai eventually proposed a human solution. She gave her Egyptian servant Hagar to Abram so that a child might be born through her. Such arrangements existed in the ancient world, but the cultural practice did not prevent the decision from producing pain. Hagar conceived. Tension immediately entered the household. Hagar looked upon Sarai differently, and Sarai dealt harshly with her. Hagar fled into the wilderness. There, near a spring, the angel of the Lord found her. The God who had made promises to Abram also saw an oppressed servant outside the household. Hagar was commanded to return, but she was also given a promise concerning her son. His descendants would become too numerous to count. The child would be named Ishmael, meaning that God hears, because God had heard Hagar's affliction. Hagar responded by calling God the one who sees her. She returned and gave birth to Ishmael. Abram was 86 years old. 13 more years passed. When Abram was 99, God appeared again and commanded him to walk faithfully. His name was changed from Abram to Abraham, reflecting the promise that he would become the father of many nations. Sarai's name became Sarah. God established circumcision as the sign of the covenant, marking the males of Abraham's household and future descendants. Ishmael would also be blessed and become the father of a great people. But the covenant line would continue through a son born to Sarah. Abraham laughed. The promise seemed impossible. He was nearly 100 years old, and Sarah was far beyond the normal age of childbearing. Yet God named the child before he was conceived. He would be called Isaac, a name associated with laughter. The laughter of disbelief would eventually become the laughter of fulfillment. Not long afterward, 3 visitors appeared near Abraham's tent at the oaks of Mamre. Abraham received them with hospitality, providing water, bread, meat, and rest. The promise was repeated. Sarah would have a son within the appointed time. Listening from the entrance of the tent, Sarah laughed within herself. The possibility seemed beyond nature and beyond expectation. The Lord asked Abraham why Sarah had laughed. Is anything too difficult for the Lord? The question would echo throughout the biblical story. Israel would face C's armies, barren land, exile, and death itself. Again and again, the promise of God would confront circumstances that appeared impossible. Before the visitors departed, the narrative turned toward Sodom and Gomorrah. The outcry against the cities was great, and their sin was exceedingly serious. Abraham pleaded for the righteous within Sodom, asking whether the judge of all the earth would sweep them away with the wicked. Beginning with 50 and moving downward, Abraham asked whether the city would be spared for the sake of a small, righteous remnant. God declared that he would spare it even for 10, but 10 could not be found. Angels entered Sodom and were received by Lot. The men of the city surrounded his house and demonstrated the violent corruption for which Sodom had become known. The messengers urged Lot and his family to flee before judgment fell. Even then, Lot hesitated. The angels took him, his wife, and his daughters by the hand and led them outside because of God's mercy. Fire and sulfur fell upon the cities of the plain. Lot's wife looked back and became a pillar of salt. Abraham saw smoke rising from the land. Lot escaped, but his story ended in isolation and family disgrace. Once he had chosen the fertile plain because of what he saw, but the place that seemed most desirable had become a place of destruction. Then, at the appointed time, Sarah gave birth to Isaac. Abraham was 100 years old. The impossible child had arrived. Sarah's laughter changed. What once expressed disbelief now expressed astonishment and joy. God had brought laughter into her life, and others would laugh with her. But conflict again entered the household. Sarah saw Ishmael behaving toward Isaac in a way she regarded as threatening, and she demanded that Hagar and Ishmael be sent away. Abraham was distressed because Ishmael was his son. God assured him that Ishmael would not be abandoned. A nation would come from him as well, but the covenant line would be traced through Isaac. Hagar and Ishmael wandered in the wilderness until their water was gone. Believing her son was about to die, Hagar placed him under a bush and moved away because she could not bear to watch. God heard the boy. Hagar's eyes were opened to a well, and they survived. Ishmael grew in the wilderness and became an archer. God remained with him. The covenant would continue through Isaac, but divine compassion was not limited to Isaac's line. Then came Abraham's greatest test. God commanded him to take Isaac, the son he loved, the child through whom the promise was supposed to continue, and go to the region of Moriah. There, Abraham was told to offer him as a burnt offering on a mountain God would show him. The command created an unbearable tension. God had forbidden murder. God had promised descendants through Isaac. Now Abraham was being asked to surrender the son upon whom the promise appeared to depend. Early the next morning, Abraham set out with Isaac and 2 servants. After 3 days, he saw the place from a distance. Abraham and Isaac continued alone. Isaac carried the wood. Abraham carried the fire and the knife. Isaac noticed that everything required for sacrifice was present except the animal. He asked his father where the lamb was. Abraham answered that God would provide the lamb. On the mountain, Abraham built an altar, arranged the wood, bound Isaac, and placed him upon it. As he reached for the knife, the angel of the Lord called his name. Abraham was stopped. He had demonstrated that he would not withhold even his son from God. Nearby, a ram was caught by its horns in a thicket. Abraham offered the ram in Isaac's place and named the location in recognition that the Lord provides. Isaac lived. The promise continued. The scene does not present child sacrifice as God's desire for Israel. Later law would condemn such practices. The test reveals Abraham's trust, while the substitute provided by God allows the promised son to return from the mountain. After Sarah died, Abraham purchased a burial place near Hebron. Though the entire land had been promised to him, the burial field was the first piece of Canaan he legally possessed. Abraham then sent his servant to find a wife for Isaac from among his relatives, rather than from the Canaanite peoples. Near the city of Nahor, the servant prayed for guidance. Rebekah appeared at a well, and not only gave him water, but offered to draw water for his camels. Her generosity matched the sign he had requested. Rebekah agreed to leave her family and travel to Canaan. She became Isaac's wife, and Isaac loved her. But Rebekah, like Sarah before her, was unable to conceive. Isaac prayed, and she became pregnant with twins. The children struggled within her so violently that she asked why this was happening. God revealed that 2 nations were in her womb, and that the older would serve the younger. The first child was Esau. The second came out holding his brother's heel and was named Jacob. The brothers grew into very different men. Esau became a skilled hunter and a man of the open country. Jacob was quieter and remained among the tents. Isaac favored Esau while Rebekah favored Jacob. Favoritism divided the family. One day Esau returned exhausted from the field and demanded some of the stew Jacob was cooking. Jacob asked for Esau's birthright in exchange. The birthright carried family privilege and inheritance. Esau, driven by immediate hunger, treated it with contempt and traded it for bread and stew. Later, when Isaac was old and nearly blind, he prepared to give Esau the formal blessing. Rebekah overheard the plan and arranged for Jacob to deceive his father. Jacob dressed in Esau's clothing. Goatskins covered his hands and neck so that he would feel hairy like his brother. He brought food prepared by Rebekah and presented himself before Isaac. Isaac heard Jacob's voice, but felt what seemed to be Esau's hands. The deception succeeded. Jacob received the blessing. When Esau entered afterward, the truth became known. His cry was bitter, and his anger turned toward murder. He planned to kill Jacob after Isaac's death. Rebekah sent Jacob away to her brother Laban. Jacob left the land alone, the child who had gained the blessing now fleeing because of the way he obtained it. On the journey he slept with a stone beneath his head. In a dream he saw a stairway or ramp extending between earth and heaven, with angels ascending and descending upon it. God stood above it and repeated the promises given to Abraham and Isaac: land, numerous descendants, blessing to the families of the earth, divine presence, and eventual return. Jacob awoke afraid and declared that the place was the house of God and the gate of heaven. He named it Bethel and set up the stone as a pillar. God's promise followed Jacob beyond the land. But Jacob was about to enter the household of a man as skilled in manipulation as he was. In Haran, Jacob met Rachel, the daughter of Laban, and loved her. He agreed to serve 7 years to marry her, but on the wedding night, Laban gave him Leah instead. The deceiver had been deceived. Jacob then married Rachel as well and served another 7 years. The rivalry between Leah and Rachel produced years of grief, competition servants given as secondary wives, and a growing household of children. Leah gave birth to Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah, Issachar, Zebulun, and a daughter named Dinah. Rachel's servant Bilhah bore Dan and Naphtali. Leah's servant Zilpah bore Gad and Asher. Finally, God enabled Rachel to conceive. She gave birth to Joseph. The family that would become Israel's 12 tribes was taking shape through a household marked by jealousy and pain. Jacob eventually left Laban and returned toward Canaan. But returning meant facing Esau, the brother he had deceived. Terrified, Jacob divided his household and sent gifts ahead. Then during the night he was left alone. A mysterious man wrestled with him until daybreak. Jacob refused to release him without a blessing. His hip was struck and put out of joint, leaving him with a lasting limp. Then his name was changed. He would no longer be called only Jacob, the name associated with grasping and supplanting. He would be called Israel, because he had struggled with God and with men and had endured. Jacob left the encounter wounded but blessed. When Esau approached, Jacob expected revenge. Instead, Esau ran to meet him, embraced him, and wept. The brothers were reconciled, though they would continue on separate paths. Jacob returned to the land, but peace did not settle permanently over his family. Rachel died while giving birth to Benjamin. Reuben committed a serious offense against his father's household. Simeon and Levi responded to the violation of Dinah with deceit and mass violence. The family of promise was growing, but it was far from righteous unity. Among Jacob's sons, Joseph became the focus of resentment. Jacob loved Joseph more openly than his other sons and gave him a special robe. Joseph also reported negatively about some of his brothers. Then Joseph described dreams in which his brothers' sheaves bowed before his sheaf, and the sun, moon, and 11 stars bowed before him. His brothers hated him even more. One day, Jacob sent Joseph to check on them while they were tending the flocks. When they saw him approaching, they plotted to kill him. Reuben persuaded them not to shed his blood directly, intending to rescue him later. Joseph was stripped of his robe and thrown into an empty cistern. While they ate, a caravan passed on its way to Egypt. Judah proposed selling Joseph rather than killing him. Joseph was taken from the pit and sold. His brothers dipped the robe in goat's blood and allowed Jacob to conclude that a wild animal had killed his son. Jacob mourned and refused to be comforted. Joseph, meanwhile, was carried into Egypt and sold to Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh. God was with Joseph, and he succeeded in Potiphar's household. But after rejecting the advances of Potiphar's wife, he was falsely accused and imprisoned. Even there, God remained with him. Joseph interpreted the dreams of Pharaoh's cupbearer and baker. The cupbearer was restored just as Joseph had said, but he forgot Joseph. 2 more years passed. Then Pharaoh dreamed of 7 healthy cows consumed by 7 gaunt cows, and 7 full heads of grain swallowed by 7 thin ones. None of Egypt's wise men could explain the dreams. The cupbearer finally remembered Joseph. Joseph was brought from prison and stood before Pharaoh. He made it clear that interpretation belonged to God, not to him. The dreams announced 7 years of abundance, followed by 7 years of devastating famine. Joseph advised Pharaoh to appoint someone to store grain during the years of plenty. Pharaoh appointed Joseph. In a single day, the Hebrew slave and prisoner became second in authority over Egypt. The famine eventually reached Canaan. Jacob sent his sons to Egypt to buy grain, but Benjamin remained behind. When the brothers appeared before Joseph, they bowed down without recognizing him. The dreams had begun to come true. Joseph tested them, accused them of being spies, and demanded that Benjamin be brought. Simeon was detained while the others returned home. When the famine grew worse, the brothers came back with Benjamin. Joseph arranged a final test by placing his silver cup in Benjamin's sack and accusing him of theft. Judah stepped forward. Years earlier, he had proposed selling Joseph. Now he offered himself in Benjamin's place so that his father would not lose another beloved son. The brothers had changed. Joseph could no longer restrain himself. He sent the Egyptians from the room and revealed his identity. His brothers were terrified. But Joseph told them not to be consumed by fear. They had intended evil against him, yet God had worked through their actions to preserve life. Joseph did not call their betrayal good. He declared that God's purpose was greater than their evil. Jacob and his entire household were brought to Egypt. Pharaoh gave them land in Goshen, where their flocks could survive. When Jacob learned that Joseph was alive, his spirit revived. The family entered Egypt, numbering only 70 persons, according to the household count preserved in Genesis. They were small, vulnerable, and dependent upon the favor of a foreign king. Yet God had preserved them through famine. Before Jacob died, he blessed his sons and spoke over their futures. To Judah, he gave words of royal significance. The scepter would not depart from Judah, and future rule would be associated with his line. The promise was becoming more specific. From humanity, the story had narrowed to Abraham. From Abraham, it had passed through Isaac. From Isaac, through Jacob. Among Jacob's sons, the line of kingship was now connected with Judah. Joseph died in Egypt after making his family promise that when God brought them back to the land, they would carry his bones with them. His final resting place in Egypt would not be permanent. The book of Genesis closes with Joseph's body in a coffin, waiting. The family had been saved from famine, but it now lived outside the promised land. The generation of Joseph would pass away. A new ruler would eventually rise who did not remember what Joseph had done for Egypt. The family that entered Egypt as honored guests was about to become a nation of slaves. A new king rose over Egypt who did not know Joseph. The family once welcomed, because it had preserved Egypt during famine, had grown into a numerous people. The Egyptians began to fear that the Israelites might become too powerful, join an enemy, and escape the land. Fear became policy. The Israelites were forced into labor and placed under harsh taskmasters. They built store cities for Pharaoh, but oppression did not reduce their numbers. The more they were crushed, the more they multiplied. So Pharaoh intensified the cruelty. Hebrew midwives were ordered to kill newborn boys. They refused because they feared God more than the king. Pharaoh then commanded that every Hebrew son be thrown into the Nile. The river that sustained Egypt became an instrument of death. During this crisis, a woman from the tribe of Levi gave birth to a son. When she could no longer hide him, she placed him in a basket coated against the water and set it among the reeds of the Nile. The child was discovered by Pharaoh's daughter. She recognized that he was a Hebrew baby, yet she had compassion on him. Through the intervention of his sister, the child's own mother was brought to nurse him. The boy marked for death was raised within Pharaoh's household. He was named Moses because he had been drawn from the water. Moses grew between two worlds. He belonged by birth to the oppressed Hebrews, yet he was raised in the palace of the ruler who enslaved them. When he was grown, he went out and saw the burdens of his people. He witnessed an Egyptian beating a Hebrew and killed the Egyptian, hiding the body in the sand. The next day, Moses attempted to intervene in a dispute between two Hebrews. One of them challenged him and asked whether Moses intended to kill him as he had killed the Egyptian. His act was known. Pharaoh sought his life, and Moses fled into the land of Midian. The man who had grown up in a royal household became a fugitive in the wilderness. There, Moses defended the daughters of a Midianite priest from shepherds who drove them away from a well. He was welcomed into their household, married Zipporah, and became a shepherd. Years passed. Egypt remained powerful. Israel remained enslaved. Moses lived far from both the palace and the people he had once tried to defend. Then, near Horeb, the mountain of God, he saw a bush burning without being consumed. As Moses approached, God called his name from the fire. He was told to remove his sandals because he stood on holy ground. The one speaking identified himself as the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. God had seen the suffering of his people. He had heard their cries. He knew their pain, and he had come to deliver them. Moses would be sent to Pharaoh to bring Israel out of Egypt. The command reached into every failure Moses had tried to leave behind. He had once acted in his own strength and fled. Now he was being sent back under divine authority. Moses objected. Who was he to stand before Pharaoh? What should he say if Israel asked for the name of the God who sent him? What if the people refused to believe him? Moses was told that God would be with him. The divine name revealed to him expressed God's self-existence and enduring faithfulness. The God of the patriarchs had not forgotten his covenant. Signs were given. Moses' staff became a serpent. His hand became diseased and was restored, and water could be turned into blood. Still, Moses resisted, saying he was not eloquent. God appointed his brother Aaron to speak with him. At last, Moses returned to Egypt. He and Aaron gathered the elders of Israel. The signs were performed, and the people believed. When they heard that God had seen their suffering, they bowed in worship. Then Moses and Aaron stood before Pharaoh. They delivered the command Israel must be released to worship the Lord. Pharaoh's answer established the central conflict. He did not recognize the authority of Israel's God, and he would not release the people. Instead, he increased their labor. The Israelites had been given straw to make bricks. Now they had to gather the straw themselves while producing the same number of bricks. The people turned against Moses. Deliverance had been announced, but their suffering became worse. Moses cried out to God, asking why he had been sent if Pharaoh's cruelty had only increased. God answered by reaffirming his covenant. He would bring Israel out, redeem them with acts of judgment, take them as his people, and bring them into the land promised to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. The Exodus would not be a negotiation between equal powers. It would reveal who truly ruled. Moses and Aaron returned to Pharaoh. Aaron's staff became a serpent, but Egyptian magicians produced signs of their own. Aaron's staff swallowed theirs, yet Pharaoh's heart remained hard. Then the plagues began. The Nile turned to blood, fish died, the river became foul, and Egypt's water supply was struck. The river associated with life and with the death of Hebrew children now became a sign of judgment. Frogs covered the land. Gnats rose from the dust. Flies filled Egyptian houses. Livestock died. Boils broke out on people and animals. Hail destroyed crops and struck the land. Locusts consumed what remained. Darkness covered Egypt. The plagues were not random disasters. They dismantled Egypt's security and exposed the limits of Pharaoh's authority. The ruler who claimed power over Israel could not command the river, the weather, the crops, the animals, or the light. At times, Pharaoh appeared to soften, but when relief came, he refused again. The text describes his heart as hard sometimes, emphasizing his own resistance, and sometimes emphasizing divine judgment upon that resistance. Pharaoh repeatedly rejected warning, until his rebellion became the path he could no longer escape. One final plague was announced. The firstborn in Egypt would die. But before judgment fell, Israel was given instructions that would shape its identity for generations. Each household was to take a lamb without defect. Its blood was to be placed on the sides and top of the doorway. The people were to eat the meal dressed for departure, with sandals on their feet and staffs in their hands. That night, judgment would pass through Egypt. The blood would mark the Israelite homes. When God saw the blood, judgment would pass over them. The event became known as Passover. Israel was commanded to remember it year after year, teaching future generations that God had delivered them from slavery. At midnight, death struck the firstborn of Egypt, from Pharaoh's household to the lowest household in the land. A great cry rose through the night. Pharaoh summoned Moses and Aaron and ordered Israel to leave. The Egyptians urged the people to go quickly. They gave them silver, gold, and clothing, and the Israelites departed with their families, livestock, and possessions. After centuries of waiting, the promise to Abraham was moving again. The descendants who had entered Egypt as one household now left as a people. God led them by a pillar of cloud during the day and a pillar of fire at night, but the route did not take them directly toward the land of Canaan. God led them toward the sea. Then Pharaoh changed his mind. He gathered chariots and pursued Israel. The people saw the Egyptian army approaching and panicked. The sea stood before them. Pharaoh's forces closed in behind them. They accused Moses of bringing them into the wilderness to die. The people had left Egypt, but Egypt's fear still ruled their imagination. Moses told them not to be afraid. They would see the deliverance of God. The cloud moved between Israel and the Egyptian army. Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and a strong wind divided the waters. The Israelites crossed on dry ground with water standing on either side. The Egyptians followed. Then the waters returned. Pharaoh's chariots and army were overwhelmed. The power that had enslaved Israel could not follow them through the sea. On the opposite shore, Moses and the Israelites sang. Miriam and the women answered with tambourines and dancing. The Lord had triumphed. The horse and rider had been thrown into the sea. Yet celebration quickly gave way to testing. In the wilderness, the people found bitter water and complained. God made it drinkable. When food became scarce, they remembered Egypt not as the place of forced labor and murdered children, but as a place where they had eaten. God provided manna bread-like food appearing with the morning dew and quail in the evening. The people were instructed to gather what they needed each day and twice as much before the Sabbath. When they had no water, they again accused Moses of bringing them out to die. God provided water from the rock. Israel's problem was no longer Pharaoh. It was whether they would trust the God who had defeated Pharaoh. The people reached Mount Sinai. There, the God who had rescued them began to define the covenant relationship into which they had been brought. Israel had not been delivered because it had already obeyed perfectly. It was delivered first, and then called to live as God's people. At the mountain, thunder sounded, lightning flashed, a thick cloud descended, and a trumpet blast grew louder. Smoke covered Sinai because God's presence came upon it in fire. The people trembled. God declared that he had carried Israel out of Egypt and brought them to himself. If they kept his covenant, they would be his treasured possession among the nations, a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. Their calling was larger than survival. They were to represent God's character among the peoples of the earth. The covenant commands began with Israel's relationship to God. They were to worship no other gods, make no idols, misuse neither God's name nor the Sabbath. The commands then addressed human relationships: honor within the family, protection of life, faithfulness in marriage, respect for property, truthfulness, and the desires of the heart. Additional laws shaped justice, worship, economic life, treatment of foreigners, care for the vulnerable, and responsibility within the community. The law was not given as a path by which Israel could claim to have rescued itself. It was the way a redeemed people was called to live. The covenant was confirmed with sacrifice. Blood was placed on the altar and upon the people as they committed themselves to obedience. Moses then went up the mountain to receive further instructions. God described a sanctuary called the tabernacle, a sacred tent where his presence would dwell among the people. Its furnishings, priesthood sacrifices, and holy spaces would teach Israel that the God who lived among them was both near and holy. But while Moses remained on the mountain, the people became impatient. They approached Aaron and demanded visible gods to lead them. Aaron collected gold and fashioned a calf. The people declared that this image represented the power that had brought them out of Egypt. At the foot of the mountain, where they had heard the command against idolatry, they broke the covenant almost immediately. They offered sacrifices, feasted, and celebrated before the image. God told Moses what had happened and announced judgment. Moses interceded, appealing to God's reputation among the nations and to the promises made to Abraham, Isaac, and Israel. Then Moses descended. When he saw the calf and the celebration, he threw down the stone tablets, breaking them at the foot of the mountain. The shattered tablets reflected the covenant the people had already broken. The calf was destroyed. Judgment fell within the camp. Yet Moses returned to plead for the people, even expressing willingness to be removed if Israel could be forgiven. God did not accept Moses as a substitute for the nation, but he renewed the covenant and revealed his character as compassionate and gracious, slow to anger, abounding in faithful love, yet not indifferent to guilt. New tablets were prepared. The tabernacle was built according to the instructions. Skilled workers shaped its curtains, altars, lampstand, ark, and priestly garments. When it was completed, the cloud covered it, and the glory of God filled the sanctuary. The great wonder of Sinai was not merely that Israel received laws, it was that the holy God chose to dwell among a people who had already shown how quickly they could rebel. The cloud now guided Israel through the wilderness. When it lifted, the people moved. When it remained, they stayed. The tribes were counted and arranged around the tabernacle. Priests were appointed. Sacrifices and purity laws ordered the nation's worship. Israel appeared ready to enter the land. But readiness in organization did not mean readiness in faith. Complaints spread again. Miriam and Aaron challenged Moses. The people became dissatisfied with manna and longed for the foods of Egypt. Moses felt overwhelmed by the burden of leading them. Still, God provided help and continued to guide them. Then Israel reached the edge of Canaan. 12 spies were sent into the land. They returned carrying evidence of its abundance. The land truly was fruitful. But 10 spies focused on fortified cities and powerful inhabitants. They described themselves as small and helpless by comparison. Joshua and Caleb gave a different report. They did not deny the strength of the enemy. They insisted that if God was with Israel, the land could be taken. The congregation accepted the fearful report. The people wept through the night and accused God of bringing them out of Egypt so that they would die by the sword. They proposed choosing another leader and returning to slavery. This was not a momentary complaint about water or food. It was a rejection of the entire journey. The generation that had seen the plagues, walked through the sea, eaten manna, heard God at Sinai, and followed the cloud, refused to enter the land. Again, Moses interceded. God forgave the nation in the sense that he did not destroy it immediately. But the rebellion carried consequences. The unbelieving generation would not enter Canaan. Israel would wander in the wilderness until that generation died. Joshua and Caleb alone among the spies would enter because they had trusted God. When the people heard the sentence, they mourned. Then, without divine command, they attempted to invade the land. Moses warned them not to go. They went anyway and were defeated. Their problem was not simply fear. It was refusal to follow God first when he commanded them to advance, and then when he commanded them to stop. The wilderness years exposed the nation repeatedly. Korah and other leaders challenged the authority of Moses and Aaron. They claimed that Moses had exalted himself over the community, but the rebellion was ultimately against the order God had established. The earth opened beneath some of the rebels, while fire consumed others. Aaron's staff later budded, blossomed, and produced almonds, confirming the priestly line. Even after these signs, the people continued to complain. Miriam died. At Meribah, the community again had no water. God instructed Moses to speak to a rock, but Moses, angered by the people, struck it twice. Water still came out. But Moses had failed to honor God as holy before Israel. Because of this, he would see the promised land, but would not lead the people into it. The leader who confronted Pharaoh and guided Israel through the sea was himself not above accountability. Aaron also died before the journey ended. Then, as Israel traveled around Edom, the people became impatient and spoke against God and Moses. Venomous serpents entered the camp, and many died. When the people confessed their sin, God told Moses to make a bronze serpent and raise it upon a pole. Those who looked at it lived. The instrument resembling their judgment became, by God's provision, the means through which life was preserved. As Israel moved nearer to Canaan, surrounding kings became afraid. Sihon and Og opposed them and were defeated. Balak, king of Moab, hired a diviner named Balaam to curse Israel. But each time Balaam attempted to speak against them, blessing came instead. Among his sayings was a vision of a future ruler, a star coming from Jacob, and a scepter rising from Israel. The language pointed beyond the wilderness generation toward the royal hope already connected with Judah. Yet Israel's danger was not limited to armies or curses from outside. At Baal Peor, Israelites joined in idolatry and sexual immorality with Moabite women. Judgment again entered the camp. A new generation now stood where the previous one had failed. Moses repeated the law, reminding them of the covenant, the consequences of rebellion, and the faithfulness of God. He urged them to love the Lord with all their heart, soul, and strength, and to teach these words to their children. He warned that possession of the land would not guarantee permanent blessing. If Israel imitated the nations and abandoned the covenant, exile would eventually follow. But even that warning contained hope. If the people returned to God after judgment, He would not forget the covenant made with their ancestors. Moses appointed Joshua as his successor. Then he climbed Mount Nebo and looked across the Jordan toward the land promised centuries earlier to Abraham. He saw it, but he did not enter. Moses died in the land of Moab, and Israel mourned him. The servant who had spoken with God confronted Pharaoh, mediated the covenant, and endured the wilderness, had reached the end of his journey. The people stood on the eastern side of the Jordan. Egypt was behind them. The wilderness generation was gone. The land was before them. But the question that had followed Israel since the sea, Moses died in the land of Moab, and Israel mourned him. The servant who had spoken with God confronted Pharaoh, mediated the covenant, and endured the wilderness, had reached the end of his journey. The people stood on the eastern side of the Jordan. Egypt was behind them. The wilderness generation was gone. The land was before them. But the question that had followed Israel since the sea remained unanswered. Would the next generation trust God where their parents had failed? Moses was gone. The generation that had left Egypt had fallen in the wilderness, and Israel now stood beside the Jordan River under a new leader. Joshua had served beside Moses for years. He had climbed partway up Sinai, guarded the tent of meeting, fought against Amalek, and remained faithful when 10 other spies spread fear through the camp. Now the responsibility Moses had carried rested upon him. God commanded Joshua to be strong and courageous. The promise given to Abraham had not been forgotten. Israel would cross the river and enter the land. But possession would require obedience. Joshua was told to meditate continually on the covenant instruction and not turn from it. The nation could not assume that military strength alone would secure its future. Before crossing, Joshua sent 2 spies to Jericho, the fortified city guarding the entrance into Canaan. They entered the house of Rahab, a woman living within the city walls. The king of Jericho learned that Israelite spies had arrived and demanded that Rahab surrender them. Instead, she hid the men and sent the king's agents in another direction. Rahab had heard what had happened in Egypt and at the Red Sea. She knew that Israel had defeated kings east of the Jordan. Fear had fallen upon Jericho, but Rahab's response was different from the city's resistance. She confessed that Israel's God was God in heaven above and on the earth below. She asked that her family be spared when the city fell. The spies agreed. A scarlet cord would hang from her window as a sign. Anyone gathered within her house would be protected. Rahab, a Canaanite woman from a condemned city, trusted Israel's God and found a place among his people. Her story revealed that the boundary between faith and rebellion did not always follow ethnic lines. Israelites could reject God despite witnessing His works, while a foreigner could hear of them and believe. Israel then prepared to cross the Jordan. The river was overflowing its banks, but as the priests carrying the ark stepped into the water, the flow stopped. The people crossed on dry ground. Once again, God brought Israel through water. The Red Sea had marked their departure from slavery. The Jordan marked their entrance into the land of promise. 12 stones were taken from the riverbed and set up as a memorial. Future children would ask what the stones meant, and their parents would tell them how God had brought Israel through the Jordan. Biblical faith was to be remembered, taught, and passed forward. The people renewed the covenant sign of circumcision and observed Passover in the land. The manna that had sustained them in the wilderness then ceased. For the first time, Israel ate produce from Canaan. A generation born in the wilderness was beginning life in the land. But Jericho stood before them. Its walls represented military strength, yet Israel was not given a conventional siege plan. For 6 days, the army marched around the city once each day, led by priests and the ark. On the 7th day, they circled it 7 times. Trumpets sounded, the people shouted, and the walls collapsed. Rahab and her household were spared. Jericho's fall was a sign that Israel's victories would not come merely from superior weapons. The God who had opened the sea and stopped the Jordan could bring down fortified cities. Yet Israel's first victory was immediately followed by failure. The next target, Ai, appeared small. Joshua sent only part of the army, assuming the city would be easily defeated. Instead, Israel was driven back. Joshua fell before God in grief. But the problem was not military strategy alone. A man named Achan had taken objects from Jericho that had been placed under the ban. His secret disobedience had brought guilt into the community. Achan's sin was exposed, and judgment followed. Only after the breach was addressed did Israel defeat Ai. The contrast was unmistakable. Jericho had seemed impossible, but obedience led to victory. Ai had seemed easy, but hidden rebellion led to defeat. The danger facing Israel was never only the strength of the people living in Canaan. Israel's own unfaithfulness could undo what no enemy army could accomplish. The conquest continued. The Gibeonites, fearing destruction, disguised themselves as travelers from a distant land and persuaded Israel's leaders to make a treaty. The leaders examined their provisions but failed to seek God's direction. When the deception became known, the treaty was still honored. The incident showed both the seriousness of sworn promises and the consequences of decisions made without discernment. Coalitions of Canaanite kings rose against Israel. Joshua's forces fought through the southern and northern regions. Cities fell, kings were defeated, and the land was divided among the tribes. Yet the conquest was not complete. Some areas remained under Canaanite control. Some tribes failed to drive out the inhabitants assigned to them. In other places, the Canaanites were subjected to forced labor rather than removed. These incomplete victories would shape Israel's future. Before Joshua died, he gathered the tribes and reviewed their history. He reminded them that Abraham had once lived beyond the Euphrates, that God had brought Israel out of Egypt, and that their victories in Canaan had depended upon divine intervention. Then he placed a choice before them. They could serve the Lord, or they could serve the gods worshipped by the surrounding nations. Joshua declared that he and his household would serve the Lord. The people promised the same. But Joshua warned them not to speak carelessly. Covenant loyalty was not a slogan. The God of Israel was holy, and worshiping him while secretly keeping idols would bring judgment. Joshua died, and the elders who had witnessed the works of God eventually died as well. Then another generation arose that did not know the Lord in the same living, covenantal sense, and did not remember what he had done for Israel. The nation entered the age of the judges. It was a period without stable national leadership. The tribes occupied the land, but frequently acted as separate communities. Canaanite religions surrounded them, offering visible gods connected with fertility, crops, weather, and local power. Israel began to worship the Baals and Ashtoreths. The covenant people adopted the gods of the nations they had been called to resist. Oppression followed. Foreign kings and neighboring peoples gained power over Israel. The nation suffered, cried out, and God raised deliverers known as judges. A cycle developed. Israel rebelled, an enemy oppressed them, the people cried out, God raised a judge, deliverance came. Then after the judge died, the nation returned to rebellion, often more deeply than before. The cycle did not move upward toward lasting reform, it spiraled downward. One of the earliest deliverers was Othniel. Then came Ehud, who freed Israel from Moabite domination. Later, a Canaanite king named Jabin oppressed the northern tribes through Sisera, the commander of an army equipped with iron chariots. At that time, Deborah served as a prophet and judge. She summoned Barak and delivered God's command to gather men from Naphtali and Zebulun. Barak agreed to go only if Deborah went with him. She went, but told him that the final honor of defeating Sisera would belong to a woman. the battle turned against the Canaanite army. Sisera fled on foot and sought refuge in the tent of Jael. Believing himself safe, he slept. Jael killed him, and Jabin's power was eventually broken. Deborah and Barak sang of the victory. Their songs celebrated tribes that responded to the call and questioned those that remained distant. Israel had been delivered, but even in victory, the nation's fragmentation was visible. Years later, Midianite raiders invaded Israel during harvest seasons, destroying crops and livestock. The Israelites hid in caves and strongholds. A man named Gideon was threshing wheat in a winepress, attempting to conceal it from the Midianites when the angel of the Lord addressed him as a mighty warrior. Gideon saw himself differently. His clan was weak, and he considered himself insignificant within his family. He asked why Israel was suffering if God was truly with them. The answer did not deny the oppression. Instead, Gideon was commissioned to confront it. He first destroyed his father's altar to Baal and cut down the associated Asherah pole. He did it at night because he was afraid, but he did it. The following morning, the townsmen demanded his death. Gideon's father challenged them to let Baal defend himself if Baal were truly a god. Gideon then gathered an army against Midian. But God reduced the force repeatedly until only 300 men remained. Israel must not claim that it had saved itself through military power. At night, Gideon's men surrounded the enemy camp, carrying trumpets, jars, and torches. At the signal, they broke the jars, raised the lights, and sounded the trumpets. Confusion spread through the Midianite camp, and the invaders turned upon one another. Gideon won a remarkable victory. The Israelites then asked him to rule over them and establish a hereditary dynasty. Gideon refused the title, declaring that God should rule over Israel. But his later actions contradicted some of his words. He collected gold from the spoils and made a religious object that became a snare. He accumulated many wives, and one of his sons was named Abimelech, a name connected with kingship. After Gideon's death, Abimelech murdered most of his brothers and made himself king. His violent rule ended violently. The deliverer's household had become part of the nation's corruption. Other judges followed. Jephthah was rejected by his family and later called back when Israel needed a warrior. He defeated the Ammonites, but his reckless vow brought tragedy upon his own household. Scripture records the vow without praising it. The age of the judges was a time when even leaders chosen for deliverance could reflect the confusion of their society. Then came Samson. Before his birth, his mother received a promise that her son would begin to deliver Israel from the Philistines. He was set apart under a Nazirite calling, and extraordinary strength was given to him. But Samson repeatedly pursued his own desires. He fought Philistines, tore apart a lion, broke restraints, and defeated groups of enemies. Yet his personal conflicts were often driven by anger, revenge, and relationships he was warned against. His strength was remarkable. His self-control was weak. Eventually, Samson became involved with Delilah. Philistine rulers paid her to discover the source of his strength. After repeated deception, Samson revealed the sign of his consecration. His hair was cut while he slept, and the Lord's empowering presence left him. The Philistines captured him, blinded him, and forced him to work in prison. The man who had followed whatever looked right to his own eyes lost his sight. At a Philistine celebration, Samson was brought out for entertainment. He prayed for strength once more and pushed against the supporting pillars of the building. The structure collapsed, killing Samson and many Philistine leaders. He achieved his greatest victory in death, but his life remained a picture of wasted calling. He had been chosen to begin delivering Israel, yet he never united the nation or broke Philistine power completely. As Judges approaches its end, the narrative becomes even darker. A Levite established a private religious arrangement involving an idol and a household shrine. The tribe of Dan stole the objects and created a corrupted center of worship. Then a woman was brutally abused and killed in Gibeah, a town belonging to Benjamin. The crime led to outrage, but the response descended into civil war. Israel nearly destroyed the tribe of Benjamin and then adopted further destructive measures to preserve it. The final chapters repeat a sentence that explains the age. There was no king in Israel, and everyone did what was right in his own eyes. The statement did not mean that any human king would automatically solve Israel's problems. It revealed the absence of faithful leadership and the rejection of God's covenant authority. Israel possessed the land, but lacked unity. It had laws, but repeatedly ignored them. It had priests, but some corrupted worship. It had deliverers, but none produced lasting transformation. Still, even during this dark era, another kind of story unfolded. A famine drove an Israelite family from Bethlehem to Moab. The father and his 2 sons died, leaving Naomi with her Moabite daughters-in-law. Naomi decided to return to Bethlehem and urged the women to remain in Moab. One of them, Ruth, refused to leave her. Ruth committed herself to Naomi's people and to Naomi's God. In Bethlehem, Ruth gathered leftover grain in the field of Boaz, a relative of Naomi's late husband. Boaz protected her, honored her loyalty, and acted as a family redeemer. He married Ruth, and they had a son named Obed. Obed became the father of Jesse. Jesse would become the father of David. While the nation descended into violence, God was quietly preserving a family line through the faithfulness of a foreign widow and the integrity of a man from Bethlehem. The future king was being prepared in an ordinary household long before Israel knew his name. The transition from judges to kings began with another woman in distress. Hannah was unable to have children and suffered continual humiliation within her family. At the sanctuary in Shiloh, she prayed with such intensity that Eli the priest initially assumed she was drunk. When he understood her grief, he blessed her. Hannah gave birth to Samuel. In fulfillment of her vow, she brought the child to serve at the sanctuary. Samuel grew under Eli, but Eli's sons abused their priestly position. They treated offerings with contempt and exploited those who came to worship. One night, Samuel heard a voice calling his name. After initially thinking Eli had called him, Samuel was instructed to listen. God announced judgment upon Eli's household. The child became a prophet at a time when the established priesthood had become corrupt. War then broke out with the Philistines. Israel brought the Ark of the Covenant into battle, treating it almost as a sacred weapon that could guarantee victory. But the Ark could not be used to manipulate God. Israel was defeated. Eli's sons were killed, and the Ark was captured. When Eli heard the news, he fell and died. The Philistines placed the Ark in the temple of their god Dagon. The following morning, Dagon's image had fallen before it. The image was raised, but it fell again and was broken. Plagues struck the Philistine cities until the Ark was returned to Israel. God's presence did not depend upon Israel's military success. Even in enemy territory, the idols of the nations could not stand before him. Samuel eventually called Israel to abandon foreign gods and return to the Lord. Under his leadership, the Philistines were defeated and a measure of order returned. But when Samuel grew old, his sons did not follow his ways. The elders of Israel demanded a king like the kings of other nations. Their request contained a legitimate concern about leadership, but it also revealed distrust. They wanted a visible ruler who would lead their armies and provide the security they associated with surrounding kingdoms. God told Samuel that the people had not merely rejected the prophet, they had rejected God as their king. Samuel warned them what monarchy could become. A king might take sons for war, daughters for service, fields for officials, and wealth for his own purposes. The people insisted. a man named Saul was chosen. He stood taller than those around him and appeared outwardly suited to royal leadership. At first, he displayed humility and military ability. When the Ammonites threatened Jabesh-Gilead, Saul united Israel and won a decisive victory. The kingdom was publicly renewed. Hope rose. Perhaps a king could finally end the instability of the judges. But Saul's reign soon revealed the danger Samuel had warned about. Before a battle with the Philistines, Saul grew impatient while waiting for Samuel. Fearing that his army would scatter, he offered the sacrifice himself instead of obeying the command he had received. Later, Saul was commanded to carry out judgment against Amalek. He spared King Agag and kept the best livestock, then claimed that the animals had been preserved for sacrifice. Samuel confronted him. Obedience was better than sacrifice. Religious language could not transform rebellion into faithfulness. Because Saul had rejected God's command, his dynasty would not continue. Samuel mourned, but God sent him to Bethlehem, to the household of Jesse. One by one, Jesse's older sons passed before the prophet. Samuel was impressed by their appearance, but God warned him not to judge by height or outward strength. Human beings looked at what was visible. God looked at the heart. The youngest son had not even been called to the gathering. He was outside caring for sheep. His name was David. Samuel anointed him, and the Spirit of the Lord came powerfully upon him. But David did not immediately take the throne. Saul remained king. The anointed shepherd returned to ordinary life until war with the Philistines brought him into the national story. A giant warrior named Goliath challenged Israel's army. Day after day he mocked Israel and demanded a single opponent. Saul and his soldiers were afraid. David arrived to bring food to his brothers and heard the challenge. He could not understand why the army of Israel allowed the living God to be defied. He refused Saul's armor and went forward with a staff, a sling, and stones from a stream. David declared that the battle belonged to God. One stone struck Goliath and the giant fell. The Philistine army fled. David became celebrated throughout Israel, and Saul brought him into royal service. But public praise awakened jealousy in the king. When the women of Israel sang that Saul had struck down thousands and David tens of thousands, Saul began to view David as a threat. The king repeatedly tried to kill the man who served him. David fled into the wilderness. Men in distress, debt, and discontent gathered around him. What began as a band of fugitives slowly became the foundation of a future army. Twice David had opportunities to kill Saul. Twice he refused, declaring that he would not seize the throne by striking the king whom God had permitted to rule. David was not without flaws. Fear sometimes drove him into questionable alliances, and his decisions placed others in danger. But he would not build his kingdom through the murder of Saul. Meanwhile, Saul's condition deteriorated. On the eve of a decisive battle, he sought guidance from a medium at Endor, the very kind of practice he had once prohibited. Through this forbidden encounter, Saul heard a final message of judgment. The next day, Israel was defeated on Mount Gilboa. Saul's sons, including Jonathan, were killed. Saul was wounded and died on the battlefield. David mourned Saul and Jonathan. He did not celebrate the fall of his enemy. Jonathan had been his closest friend, and Saul, despite his failures, had been Israel's king. David was then anointed king over Judah at Hebron. For years, Saul's surviving household and David's supporters struggled for control. The conflict cost lives and exposed rivalries within David's own circle. Eventually, the northern tribes came to Hebron and recognized David as king over all Israel. The shepherd from Bethlehem now ruled the united nation. David captured Jerusalem, a a strategically located city not previously controlled as an Israelite capital. He made it the center of the kingdom and brought the ark there with celebration. After centuries of wandering slavery, tribal fragmentation, foreign oppression, and civil conflict, Israel finally had land, national unity, a capital, and a king. The promise appeared closer than ever to fulfillment. But the arrival of a faithful king would not remove the problem first revealed in Eden. David could defeat giants and unite tribes. The greater question was whether he and the kingdom built around him could remain faithful when power, wealth, and security replaced the dangers of the wilderness. David now ruled a united Israel from Jerusalem. The tribes had recognized his authority. The Philistine threat had been weakened. The Ark of the Covenant had been brought into the capital, and the kingdom appeared more secure than at any earlier point in Israel's history. David lived in a palace of cedar, but the ark remained within a tent. The contrast troubled him. He told the prophet Nathan that he wanted to build a permanent house for God. At first, Nathan encouraged the plan, but that night, God gave the prophet a different message. David would not be the one to build the temple. Instead, God reminded him of how far he had come. David had been taken from the pasture, from following sheep, and made ruler over Israel. God had been with him through danger and had cut down his enemies. Then the promise moved beyond David's own lifetime. God would establish a house for David, not a building of stone, but a dynasty. One of David's descendants would succeed him. That son would build the temple, and his throne would be established. God would relate to the king as a father to a son. When the king sinned, discipline would come. But the covenant commitment would not be withdrawn in the same way it had been withdrawn from Saul. David's house, kingdom, and throne would endure before God. This promise became known as the Davidic covenant. The expectation of a coming ruler was becoming more specific. The promise had once concerned the offspring of the woman. It had narrowed through Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Kingship had been connected with Judah. Now the royal hope was tied to David's house. A future son of David would carry the expectation of an enduring kingdom. David responded with humility. He entered the presence of God and asked who he was and what his family was, that he had been brought so far. The shepherd understood that the promise was not a reward for human greatness. It was an act of divine grace. David's victories continued. Neighboring peoples were defeated or brought under control. Israel's borders expanded, and tribute flowed toward Jerusalem. The king also remembered a promise made to Jonathan. He asked whether anyone remained from Saul's family to whom he could show covenant kindness. A son of Jonathan named Mephibosheth had survived. He had been injured as a child and was unable to walk normally. Mephibosheth may have expected the new king to eliminate him as a possible rival. Instead, David restored Saul's family land to him and gave him a permanent place at the royal table. The son of the fallen dynasty ate like one of the king's own sons. For a time, David's reign reflected justice, mercy, military strength, and covenant faithfulness. Then the story reached its darkest turning point. While Israel's armies went out to war, David remained in Jerusalem. One evening he walked upon the roof of the palace and saw a woman bathing. Her name was Bathsheba. David learned that she was the wife of Uriah the Hittite, one of his own soldiers. The information should have ended the matter. Instead, David sent for her. He took the wife of a man who was fighting in his army, and she became pregnant. David then attempted to conceal what he had done. He summoned Uriah from the battlefield and encouraged him to go home, hoping that the child would appear to be his. But Uriah refused to enjoy the comforts of his house while the ark, the army, and his fellow soldiers remained in the field. David tried again, even making Uriah drunk. Still, Uriah did not go home. The king then sent him back to battle, carrying a sealed message that arranged his own death. Joab, David's military commander, placed Uriah where the fighting was most dangerous and withdrew support. Uriah was killed. After the period of mourning, David brought Bathsheba into his household. From the outside, the scandal appeared contained, but God had seen everything. Nathan came to David with a story. A rich man possessed many sheep and cattle, while a poor man owned only one small lamb. The poor man loved the animal and treated it like a member of his family. When a traveler came to the rich man refused to take one of his own animals. Instead, he took the poor man's only lamb and prepared it for the guest. David became angry and declared that the rich man deserved judgment. Nathan answered directly. David was the man. God had given him the kingdom and delivered him from Saul, yet David had despised God's command, taken Uriah's wife, and caused Uriah's death. David confessed that he had sinned. Unlike Saul, he did not defend himself with excuses or place the blame on others. The confession was real and forgiveness was announced. But forgiveness did not erase every earthly consequence. Violence would rise within David's own household. The secrecy of his sin would give way to public disgrace. The child born to Bathsheba became ill and died. David fasted and pleaded while the child lived. After the child's death, he rose, washed, worshipped, and ate. His servants were confused. David explained that while the child lived, there was still reason to seek mercy. Once the child died, fasting could not bring him back. Later, Bathsheba gave birth to another son. His name was Solomon. The future temple builder was born into a household already marked by grief. The consequences Nathan announced soon spread through David's family. David's son Amnon became consumed with desire for his half-sister Tamar. Through deception, he isolated and violated her, then rejected her. Tamar's brother Absalom took her into his home. David became angry when he heard what had happened, but the narrative does not record him bringing effective justice against Amnon. Absalom waited. 2 years later, he arranged a feast and ordered his servants to kill Amnon. Then he fled. The king who had once responded decisively to injustice now seemed paralyzed within his own household. His failures as a father and king allowed bitterness to deepen. After several years, Absalom returned to Jerusalem. But reconciliation remained incomplete. Absalom began to position himself as an alternative ruler. He appeared at the city gate, listened to disputes, and told people that their concerns would receive justice if he were appointed judge. He stole the hearts of Israel. Then Absalom declared himself king at Hebron. The rebellion spread rapidly. David was forced to leave Jerusalem. The king who had once fled from Saul now fled from his own son. He crossed the Kidron Valley, climbed the Mount of Olives barefoot, and wept as he went. David refused to treat the ark as a guarantee of victory. He sent it back to Jerusalem, saying that if God showed him favor, he would return and see it again. The outcome rested with God. Absalom entered Jerusalem and publicly claimed his father's household, fulfilling part of Nathan's warning. David's supporters regrouped east of the Jordan. When battle came, David instructed his commanders to deal gently with Absalom. But during the fighting, Absalom's hair became caught in the branches of a tree while the animal beneath him moved away. He was left hanging between earth and sky. Joab ignored David's command and killed him. The rebellion ended. When news reached David, he did not celebrate the recovery of his throne. He cried for his son. He wished that he had died instead. David's grief was so overwhelming that the soldiers who had risked their lives for him returned as though they had been defeated. Joab rebuked the king and demanded that he honor those who had remained loyal. David returned to Jerusalem, but the kingdom had changed. old rivalries remained. Another rebellion arose under a man named Sheba. Joab killed Amasa, whom David had appointed over the army, and continued to exercise violent power within the kingdom. David's reign had been restored, but the unity of Israel was becoming increasingly fragile. Near the end of his life, David ordered a census of Israel's fighting men. The motives behind the act are not explained in complete detail, but the census reflected a serious failure. The king who had once faced Goliath with confidence in God now counted the military strength of the nation. Afterward, David recognized his sin. Judgment came in the form of a plague. As destruction approached Jerusalem, David saw the angel of judgment near the threshing floor of Araunah. He pleaded that the punishment fall upon him and his household rather than upon the people. David purchased the threshing floor and built an altar there. The plague stopped. That location would later become connected with the temple Solomon built. Even the site of Israel's greatest sanctuary was linked to judgment, repentance, sacrifice, and mercy. As David grew old, the question of succession became urgent. His son Adonijah attempted to make himself king. He gathered supporters, including Joab and the priest Abiathar, and held a royal celebration without David's authorization. But Nathan and Bathsheba informed David of the plot. David publicly declared Solomon his successor. Solomon was placed upon the king's mule brought to the spring of Gihon and anointed. Trumpets sounded, and the people proclaimed him king. Adonijah's celebration collapsed as news of Solomon's coronation reached his supporters. Before David died, he charged Solomon to walk in God's ways and uphold the covenant. He also gave instructions concerning unresolved political threats within the kingdom. David's life ended after 40 years of rule. He had brought unity, established Jerusalem, defeated enemies, and received the promise of an enduring dynasty. He had also committed adultery, arranged a death, failed to restrain violence within his household, and watched rebellion rise from among his own sons. Scripture did not hide either side of his life. David was Israel's defining king, but he was not the flawless king the covenant hope required. Solomon now sat upon the throne. The early years of his reign were marked by decisive action against those who threatened the kingdom. Adonijah was executed after making a request Solomon interpreted as another attempt at the throne. Joab was killed after seeking refuge at the altar. Abiathar was removed from the priesthood and other rivals were addressed. The kingdom became firmly established in Solomon's hands. Then God appeared to him in a dream and invited him to ask for what he desired. Solomon did not request long life, wealth, or the death of his enemies. He asked for a discerning heart so that he could govern the people and distinguish between right and wrong. God was pleased. Solomon received wisdom, and he was also promised wealth and honor. His discernment soon became famous. 2 women came before him, each claiming to be the mother of the same living child. With no witnesses available, Solomon proposed dividing the child with a sword. One woman accepted the decision. The other begged that the child be given away rather than killed. Solomon recognized her as the true mother. News of his wisdom spread. Israel prospered under an organized administration. The kingdom's influence expanded. Trade increased. Solomon spoke thousands of proverbs and songs and gained knowledge associated with plants, animals, and the natural world. Rulers and representatives came to hear him. But Solomon's greatest undertaking was the construction of the temple. David had gathered resources and prepared for it, but Solomon was the son appointed to build. Workers cut timber in Lebanon, stones were prepared, skilled craftsmen produced the furnishings. The temple rose in Jerusalem with an inner sanctuary containing the Ark of the Covenant. Its structure, priesthood sacrifices, and symbolism developed themes first introduced through the tabernacle. When the temple was completed, the Ark was brought inside. The glory of God filled the building so powerfully that the priests could not continue their service. Solomon stood before the assembly and prayed. He acknowledged that even the highest heavens could not contain God, much less the temple he had built. The building was not a prison for divine presence, it was a covenant center toward which Israel could pray. Solomon asked that God hear prayers offered in times of injustice, defeat drought, famine, exile, and repentance. He even included foreigners who would come because they had heard of God's great name. The promise to Abraham remained in view. Israel's calling was never intended to end with Israel. The temple was dedicated with sacrifice and celebration. The kingdom had reached extraordinary heights. The descendants of Abraham lived in the land. The tribes were united. A son of David sat upon the throne. The temple stood in Jerusalem. The nations heard of Solomon's wisdom. The Queen of Sheba came to test him with difficult questions. After seeing his wisdom, wealth officials, servants, and worshipful, she was overwhelmed. She praised the God of Israel for placing Solomon upon the throne to establish justice and righteousness. This was the kingdom as it should have appeared, a display of order, wisdom, abundance, and the blessing of God before the nations. But beneath the splendor, fractures were forming. Solomon accumulated wealth on a scale beyond earlier kings. Gold filled Jerusalem. Horses and chariots were imported and multiplied. He also formed marriage alliances with foreign royal houses. Solomon loved many foreign women from nations whose worship threatened Israel's covenant loyalty. The law had warned that Israel's king must not multiply wives, horses, and wealth for himself. These were not arbitrary restrictions. Each accumulation could redirect royal trust from God toward military power, economic strength, and political alliances. In Solomon's old age, his wives turned his heart toward other gods. He built high places for foreign deities, including gods associated with practices condemned by Israel's covenant. The king who built the temple of the Lord also constructed places of worship for idols. His heart was divided. God announced that the kingdom would be torn from Solomon's house. Yet because of the covenant with David, the division would not occur fully during Solomon's lifetime, and one tribe would remain connected to David's dynasty and Jerusalem. Adversaries began to rise. Among them was Jeroboam, a capable official over forced labor. The prophet Ahijah met him and tore a new garment into 12 pieces. Jeroboam was told to take 10. The symbolic act announced that most of the kingdom would be given to him. But the promise came with a condition. If Jeroboam obeyed God's commands, his house could be established. Solomon attempted to kill him, and Jeroboam fled to Egypt. The king whose wisdom had once drawn the nations now feared the man chosen to receive part of his kingdom. Solomon died after a reign of 40 years. His son Rehoboam traveled to Shechem, where the northern tribes gathered to make him king. They presented a request. Solomon's administration had placed heavy demands upon them through labor and taxation. If Rehoboam reduced the burden, they would serve him. The young king asked for time. The older counselors who had served Solomon advised him to speak kindly and become a servant to the people. If he did so, they said, the tribes would remain loyal. But Rehoboam rejected their counsel. He turned to the younger men who had grown up with him. They advised him to display strength and increase the burden. Rehoboam followed their words. He told the people that his father had made their yoke heavy, but he would make it heavier. Where Solomon had disciplined them with whips, Rehoboam would use even harsher measures. The response shattered the kingdom. The northern tribes rejected David's house and called Jeroboam back from Egypt. They made him king over Israel. Only Judah, with Benjamin closely connected to it, remained under Rehoboam's authority. The united monarchy was over. The division was political, but it quickly became religious. Jeroboam feared that if his people continued traveling to Jerusalem for worship, their loyalty might return to David's dynasty. So he created alternative sanctuaries at Bethel and Dan. He made golden calves and presented them as representations connected with the God who had brought Israel out of Egypt. The sin at Sinai had returned as national policy. Jeroboam appointed priests outside the established Levitical order and created his own religious festival. Worship was redesigned to protect political power. A prophet warned that judgment would eventually come upon the altar at Bethel, but Jeroboam did not abandon his system. In the south, Rehoboam fortified cities and maintained David's throne in Jerusalem. Yet Judah also fell into idolatry. Foreign worship sites spread. Practices associated with the Canaanite nations appeared within the land. In the 5th year of Rehoboam's reign, Shishak, king of Egypt, invaded Jerusalem and carried away treasures from the temple and royal palace. The golden shields Solomon had made were taken. Rehoboam replaced them with bronze. The change captured the condition of the kingdom. The age of gold had become an age of imitation. Israel now existed as two kingdoms. The northern kingdom retained the name Israel and was often associated with its dominant tribe Ephraim. The southern kingdom became known as Judah and continued under David's descendants. The division would produce rival capitals, competing sanctuaries, political conspiracies, civil conflict, and generations of kings. Some rulers would seek reform. Many would deepen the rebellion. Prophets would rise to warn both kingdoms that military strength, royal ancestry, and religious ceremonies could not protect a people who continually rejected the covenant. David's throne still stood in Jerusalem. The temple still stood upon the mountain. The promise had not disappeared, but the kingdom that once seemed to fulfill Israel's hope had fractured in a single generation. And from this point forward, every king would be measured against the covenant, while both Israel and Judah moved steadily toward a judgment their prosperity could no longer conceal. The kingdom had divided. In Jerusalem, David's descendants continued to rule Judah. In the north, a succession of dynasties fought for control of Israel. The two kingdoms shared a common ancestry and claimed the same God, yet they frequently treated one another as enemies. The division that began under Rehoboam and Jeroboam would never be fully healed. Jeroboam's religious system at Bethel and Dan became the defining sin of the northern kingdom. Later kings were repeatedly measured by whether they continued in the sins of Jeroboam. Even when dynasties changed through conspiracy and bloodshed, the golden calves remained. Political power depended upon religious compromise. After Jeroboam, kings rose and fell rapidly. Some ruled only a few years. One ruled only days before being killed. Military commanders assassinated rulers and established new houses only to have their own descendants removed. Israel possessed a throne, but not stability. Eventually, a commander named Omri established a powerful dynasty and built Samaria as the northern capital. His son Ahab inherited the throne. Ahab married Jezebel, a princess from Sidon. The marriage strengthened political ties, but it also brought aggressive worship of Baal into Israel's royal court. Ahab built a temple and altar for Baal in Samaria, while Jezebel supported hundreds of pagan prophets and pursued the prophets of the Lord. At this moment, Elijah entered the story. He appeared suddenly before Ahab and announced that no rain would fall except at his word. The drought struck directly at Baal's supposed authority. Baal was worshipped as a god connected with storms, rain, and agricultural fertility. Yet the skies remained closed at the declaration of Israel's God. Elijah withdrew to the wilderness, where ravens brought him food. When the stream dried up, he traveled beyond Israel to Zarephath in Sidon, the very region associated with Jezebel's background. There he met a widow gathering sticks. She possessed only enough flour and oil to prepare a final meal for herself and her son before they expected to die. Elijah asked her to prepare food for him first and promised that the flour and oil would not run out until rain returned. The widow trusted the word. Her household survived the famine. When her son later died, Elijah cried out to God, and the child's life returned. While Israel's royal house pursued Baal, a foreign widow received provision and witnessed the power of Israel's God. After years of drought, Elijah returned to confront Ahab. The king accused the prophet of troubling Israel. Elijah answered that Ahab and his family had brought trouble by abandoning God's commands and following Baal. A contest was arranged on Mount Carmel. Ahab gathered Israel along with the prophets of Baal. Elijah stood before the people and asked how long they would continue wavering between two positions. If the Lord was God, they should follow him. If Baal was God, they should follow Baal. 2 sacrifices were prepared. Baal's prophets called upon their God from morning until midday. They shouted, danced, and cut themselves, but no answer came. Elijah mocked the silence, asking whether Baal was busy traveling or asleep. The prophets continued until evening. Still, there was no voice. Then Elijah repaired a ruined altar of the Lord using 12 stones, one for each tribe of Israel. Even though the kingdom had divided, the covenant identity of the 12 tribes had not been erased. He arranged the sacrifice and ordered water to be poured over it repeatedly until the trench surrounding the altar was filled. Then Elijah prayed. He asked that Israel know that the Lord was God and that he was turning their hearts back. Fire fell. It consumed the sacrifice, the wood, the stones, the dust, and the water. The people fell upon their faces and confessed that the Lord was God. Soon afterward, clouds formed and rain returned. Carmel was a decisive public victory, but it did not produce lasting national repentance. When Jezebel heard what had happened to her prophets, she threatened Elijah's life. The prophet fled. Exhausted and discouraged, he traveled into the wilderness and asked to die. The man who had stood alone before hundreds of prophets now felt entirely alone. God met him with food rest and then a journey to Horeb, the mountain associated with Moses and the covenant. There, Elijah experienced wind, earthquake, and fire, but the divine message came through a quiet, gentle voice. God revealed that Elijah's mission was not finished. Kings would be appointed, judgment would come, and Elisha would succeed him. Elijah was also told that 7,000 in Israel had not bowed to Baal. The faithful remnant was larger than he could see. Ahab's reign continued to reveal the corruption of royal power. Near the palace at Jezreel was a vineyard belonging to Naboth. Ahab wanted the land, but Naboth refused to sell the inheritance of his ancestors. The king returned home angry. Jezebel arranged for false witnesses to accuse Naboth of cursing God and the king. Naboth was executed, and Ahab took possession of the vineyard. Elijah confronted him there. The king had allowed murder in order to seize what the law protected. Judgment was announced against Ahab's household. Ahab humbled himself, temporarily delaying part of the disaster, but the dynasty was already moving toward destruction. Ahab later died in battle, despite attempting to disguise himself. An arrow struck him, and his blood collected in his chariot. His sons followed, but the house of Ahab did not endure. During this period, Elijah was taken from the earth in a whirlwind, as a chariot and horses of fire appeared. Elisha received his mantle and continued the prophetic ministry. Elisha's work included both national events and acts of compassion toward ordinary people. He provided oil for an indebted widow, raised the son of a Shunammite woman, purified poisoned food, and fed a large group from a small amount of bread. He also healed Naaman, commander of the Syrian army, from a skin disease. Naaman initially resisted the simple command to wash in the Jordan, but when he humbled himself and obeyed, he was restored. He confessed that there was no God in all the earth except the God of Israel. Again, a foreigner responded with faith, while many within Israel remained resistant. Elisha also became involved in moments of warfare and political transition. He warned kings, revealed enemy movements, and announced the rise and fall of rulers. But prophetic miracles did not permanently change the direction of the northern kingdom. Jehu was anointed to destroy Ahab's house. He killed Ahab's descendants, brought about Jezebel's death, and eliminated Baal's royal center. Yet Jehu did not remove the golden calves at Bethel and Dan. He destroyed one form of idolatry while preserving another that supported his own rule. The pattern continued. Kings sometimes accomplished limited reforms or military victories, but none restored covenant faithfulness throughout Israel. Meanwhile, Judah experienced a different but equally unstable history. Because David's dynasty remained in Jerusalem, royal succession was more continuous. Yet continuity did not guarantee righteousness. Some kings followed God. Others promoted idolatry, injustice, and violence. At times, the influence of Ahab's house entered Judah directly through royal marriage. Athaliah, connected with Ahab's dynasty, attempted to destroy David's royal line and seize the throne. One infant prince, Joash, was hidden in the temple and preserved. For 6 years, the survival of the Davidic dynasty depended upon a concealed child. When Joash was revealed, Athaliah was removed, and the covenant line continued. But even Joash, who began under priestly guidance and repaired the temple, later turned away and ordered the death of a prophet who confronted him. Good beginnings did not guarantee faithful endings. As generations passed, a new imperial power grew in the northeast. Assyria expanded through military terror, forced tribute, siege warfare, and mass deportation. Smaller kingdoms throughout the region were forced to choose between submission, rebellion, and fragile alliances. Israel and Judah increasingly looked to political strategy rather than covenant faithfulness. Prophets rose to interpret what kings saw only as international conflict. Amos came from Judah and spoke to the prosperous northern kingdom. Israel's elite lived in comfort. Religious festivals continued, sacrifices were offered, songs filled sanctuaries. But the poor were exploited. Justice was bought, and the powerful treated human lives as commodities. Amos declared that God rejected worship separated from righteousness. Songs and offerings could not conceal oppression. Justice was to roll down like waters, and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream. Hosea's life became another prophetic sign. His broken marriage reflected Israel's unfaithfulness. The nation had pursued other gods while still claiming covenant identity. Yet Hosea also spoke of persistent love. Judgment would come, but God's purpose was not merely destruction. He desired to heal, restore, and draw his people back. The prophets did not offer comfort without repentance, nor did they announce judgment without hope. But Israel refused to listen. The northern kingdom suffered repeated coups and shrinking territory. Kings turned to Assyria for help, paid tribute, and then rebelled when political circumstances changed. Finally, King Hoshea withheld tribute and sought assistance from Egypt. Assyria responded. Samaria was besieged for years, then the city fell. The northern kingdom of Israel ceased to exist as an independent nation. Large portions of the population were deported into Assyrian territories, while other peoples were settled in the land. The tribes became scattered among foreign populations, giving rise to later traditions concerning the lost tribes of Israel. The biblical explanation for the collapse is clear. Israel's fall was not caused merely by an unfortunate military defeat. The people had worshipped other gods, rejected the covenant, ignored the prophets, practiced injustice, and imitated the nations around them. Assyria was the instrument. Covenant rebellion was the deeper cause. The northern kingdom had lasted for generations, but not one of its royal dynasties restored the nation to enduring faithfulness. Jeroboam's system had promised political security. It ended in exile. Judah survived, but the Assyrian threat soon reached Jerusalem. King Ahaz of Judah faced pressure from Israel and Syria. Instead of trusting God, he appealed to Assyria for protection. The prophet Isaiah confronted him and offered a sign. Ahaz refused, under the appearance of humility, though he had already chosen political dependence. Isaiah then spoke of a child whose birth would signify God's presence with his people. Emmanuel, God with us. Isaiah's prophecies moved between immediate historical crises and a greater future hope. He spoke of judgment upon Judah and the nations, but also of a coming ruler connected with David. A child would be born. Government would rest upon him. He would rule with justice and righteousness. A shoot would emerge from the apparently cut-down stump of Jesse. The Spirit of God would rest upon him. Under his reign, creation itself would move toward peace. These promises did not erase the approaching crisis. They declared that Assyria, Babylon, and every human empire would not have the final word. After Ahaz came Hezekiah. He removed idols, reopened proper worship, and trusted God more faithfully than many kings before him. During his reign, Assyria invaded Judah and captured fortified cities. The Assyrian king Sennacherib sent officials to Jerusalem, mocking Hezekiah and challenging Israel's God. They pointed to the nations Assyria had already conquered and asked why Jerusalem should expect a different outcome. Hezekiah brought the threat before God and prayed. Isaiah announced that the Assyrian king would not conquer Jerusalem. That night, disaster struck the Assyrian camp. Sennacherib withdrew and eventually died in his own land. Jerusalem survived. But deliverance from Assyria did not mean Judah's danger had passed. Hezekiah later received visitors from Babylon and showed them the wealth of his kingdom. Isaiah warned that a day would come when these treasures and members of the royal household would be carried to Babylon. Hezekiah's son Manasseh became one of Judah's most destructive kings. He rebuilt idolatrous shrines, practiced occult rituals, and placed pagan worship within the temple courts. He shed so much innocent blood that Jerusalem was described as filled from one end to the other. According to Chronicles, Manasseh later humbled himself after being taken captive and attempted reform. Yet the damage of his reign had spread deeply through the nation. His son Amon continued in rebellion and was assassinated. Then Josiah became king while still a child. During temple repairs, a scroll of the law was discovered. When its words were read to Josiah, he tore his clothing in grief. He realized how far Judah had departed from the covenant. The king launched a sweeping reform. Idols were removed. Pagan priests were dismissed. High places were destroyed. The Passover was celebrated with renewed seriousness. Josiah sought to restore Judah to covenant faithfulness. But the prophetess Huldah announced that judgment would still come because the nation's rebellion had accumulated for generations. Josiah's personal humility would delay the disaster during his lifetime, but it would not erase the consequences of persistent national sin. Josiah later died in battle against Pharaoh Necho at Megiddo. His death shattered the hope that reform had permanently changed Judah's direction. The kings who followed were weaker and less faithful. Egypt briefly controlled Judah, but Babylon soon replaced Assyria as the dominant empire. Nebuchadnezzar defeated Egypt's forces and extended Babylonian authority over the region. Judah's kings became vassals, caught between submission to Babylon and hopes of Egyptian assistance. During the early stages of Babylonian control, groups of Judeans were taken into exile. Among them were Daniel and other young men from prominent families. They were brought into Babylonian service, taught the language and literature of the empire, and given new names associated with Babylonian culture. The empire intended to reshape their identity. Daniel and his companions learned within Babylon's system without surrendering their loyalty to God. They refused food that would compromise their convictions and were permitted an alternative. God gave them wisdom and understanding. Daniel later interpreted Nebuchadnezzar's dream of a great statue made from different materials. The image represented successive kingdoms, each eventually giving way to another. But a stone, not cut by human hands, struck the statue and became a great mountain. The message was unmistakable. Empires rise, dominate, and fall. God's kingdom will ultimately outlast them all. Daniel's companions, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, were later commanded to bow before a golden image erected by Nebuchadnezzar. They refused. They declared that God was able to deliver them from the furnace, but even if he did not, they would not worship the image. They were thrown into the fire. Yet a fourth figure appeared with them, and they emerged unharmed. Faithfulness in exile did not depend upon control of the throne, possession of the land, or freedom from danger. It depended upon refusing to give worship to another power. Back in Judah, Jeremiah warned that Babylonian domination was not a temporary political accident. He had been called as a prophet before birth and sent to a people who would often refuse to listen. His message brought him ridicule, isolation, imprisonment, and accusations of treason. Jeremiah stood at the temple gate and warned Judah not to trust in the building as though its presence made judgment impossible. Centuries earlier, Israel had treated the ark as a guarantee of victory and lost it in battle. Now Judah treated the temple in the same way. They repeated religious words while practicing injustice, idolatry, and violence. The temple of the Lord could not protect those who rejected the Lord of the temple. Jeremiah used symbolic actions to communicate the approaching disaster. He wore a yoke to represent Babylonian rule. He purchased a field while Jerusalem was threatened, demonstrating that land would one day be bought and sold there again. He wrote words of warning, but King Jehoiakim cut the scroll apart and burned it piece by piece. The destruction of the scroll could not destroy the message. It was written again. Jeremiah urged Judah to submit to Babylon because the period of judgment had arrived. False prophets promised rapid deliverance, but Jeremiah warned that the exile would not end within a few months or years. He sent a letter to those already in Babylon. They were to build houses, plant gardens, form families, and seek the welfare of the city where they lived. Their exile would last long enough to require faithful life in a foreign land. Yet Jeremiah also delivered one of the Old Testament's greatest promises. A new covenant would come. It would not be like the covenant the ancestors broke after leaving Egypt. God's instruction would be written upon the heart. He would forgive sin and remember guilt no more. The problem first revealed in Eden and exposed throughout Israel's history could not be solved by new political circumstances alone. The human heart required transformation. Judah continued to resist. King Jehoiachin was taken to Babylon, and Zedekiah was placed upon the throne. Eventually, Zedekiah rebelled against Nebuchadnezzar. Babylonian armies surrounded Jerusalem. The siege produced hunger, fear, and social collapse. Jeremiah continued to warn that the city would fall. For speaking what the leaders did not want to hear, he was lowered into a muddy cistern and left to die. An official named Ebed-Melech intervened and rescued him. Then the Babylonian army broke through the walls. Zedekiah attempted to flee but was captured. His sons were killed before him, and then his eyes were put out. The last image he saw was the destruction of his royal line. He was taken to Babylon in chains. Jerusalem was burned. The royal palace was destroyed. The temple built by Solomon was set on fire. Its treasures were carried away. The walls of the city were torn down. Large numbers of people were deported. The throne of David disappeared from Jerusalem. The sanctuary where the glory of God had once filled the house lay in ruins. The warnings of Moses, the judges, the prophets, and generations of reformers had reached their terrible conclusion. Judah had followed Israel into exile. For those who survived the destruction raised questions deeper than politics. Had the covenant failed? Had Babylon defeated Israel's God? Could the promise to Abraham survive without the land? Could the promise to David survive without a king? Could worship continue without the temple? Ezekiel, a priest living among the exiles, received visions that addressed these questions. He saw the glory of God, not confined to Jerusalem, but appearing in Babylon. The divine presence was mobile, sovereign, and able to meet the exiles in a foreign land. Ezekiel was shown the corruption within Jerusalem and the departure of God's glory from the temple before its destruction. Babylon had not conquered God by burning his house. The glory had departed in judgment. But Ezekiel also spoke of restoration. God would gather his scattered people. He would cleanse them. He would remove the heart of stone and give a heart of flesh. He would place his spirit within them and enable them to walk in his ways. In one vision, Ezekiel stood in a valley filled with dry bones. The bones represented a people who believed their hope had perished. At God's command, the bones came together. Flesh covered them. Breath entered them, and they stood as a vast living army. Exile looked like national death. God could bring life from the grave. Ezekiel also spoke of a future shepherd from the line of David who would rule over God's people. The failed shepherds of Israel had exploited the flock. God himself would seek the lost, bind the injured, and appoint a faithful shepherd over them. Isaiah's prophetic vision had also looked beyond judgment. He described a servant who would bring justice to the nations, act faithfully where Israel had failed, suffer rejection, and bear the consequences of the sins of others. The servant would be wounded, yet through his suffering many would be accounted righteous. The Old Testament's hope was no longer simply for a return to previous conditions. Israel had already experienced land law, kings, priests, and a temple. None of these, in the hands of sinful people, had produced lasting faithfulness. What was needed was deeper. A new heart, a new covenant, a faithful shepherd, a righteous son of David, a servant who would suffer, a kingdom that human empires could not destroy. In Babylon, Daniel continued to receive visions of beasts representing violent kingdoms rising from the sea. Human empires appeared powerful, but they were portrayed as less than truly human, driven by pride, conquest, and destruction. Then Daniel saw one like a son of man coming with the clouds of heaven. He received authority, glory, and a kingdom. His dominion would not pass away. The saints of the Most High would share in that kingdom. Babylon seemed permanent, but it was not. Nebuchadnezzar himself was humbled after boasting over the greatness of the city he had built. Only after acknowledging heaven's rule was his sanity and position restored. Later, under Belshazzar, Babylon's leaders held a feast using vessels taken from Jerusalem's temple. A hand appeared and wrote judgment upon the wall. Daniel interpreted the message. Babylon had been weighed and found deficient. That very night the city fell to the Medes and Persians. The empire that burned Jerusalem and carried away the temple treasures was itself conquered. A new ruler named Cyrus now controlled Babylon and the lands once held by its kings. The exiles remained far from Jerusalem, but the political world had changed in a single night. long before Isaiah had named Cyrus as the ruler through whom restoration would begin. Now the question was no longer whether Babylon could fall. It had fallen. The question was what God would do next. The land remained devastated. Jerusalem's walls remained broken. The temple remained in ruins. Most of the covenant people had been born outside Judah. David's throne remained empty. Yet the prophets had declared that exile would not be the final chapter. Judgment had stripped Israel of nearly everything it had trusted, but it had not destroyed the promise. Babylon had fallen. The empire that destroyed Jerusalem, burned the temple, and carried Judah into exile had been replaced by Persia. A new ruler now controlled the lands stretching from the ancient cities of Mesopotamia to the borders of Egypt. His name was Cyrus. Unlike Babylonian policy, which often uprooted conquered peoples and concentrated them within imperial territory, Persian rulers frequently permitted displaced communities to return to their ancestral lands and restore local sanctuaries. For the people of Judah, this political change became the doorway to something the prophets had promised for generations. Cyrus issued a decree allowing the exiles to return to Jerusalem and rebuild the temple of the Lord. The announcement must have seemed almost impossible. Many of those living in Babylon had never seen Jerusalem. They had been born in exile. They knew the city through the grief of their parents, the songs of their community, and the promises of the prophets. The land of Judah was not simply another province to them. It represented the covenant made with Abraham. Jerusalem represented the city of David. The temple represented the place where God had chosen to make his name known. Now the road home was open. But not everyone returned. Decades had passed since the first deportations. Families had established homes, businesses, and relationships throughout the Persian Empire. Returning to Judah meant leaving security for a devastated land. The journey required more than permission. It required faith. A group of exiles traveled to Jerusalem under leaders including Sheshbazzar and Zerubbabel, a descendant of David's royal line. Joshua the high priest also played a central role in the restored community. They carried vessels that had been taken from the temple by the Babylonians. The journey reversed part of the exile. Objects removed from Jerusalem were being returned. Descendants of the deported were walking toward the land their ancestors had lost. Yet when they arrived, they did not find the glory of Solomon's kingdom waiting for them. Jerusalem was scarred by destruction. Its walls were broken. The temple was gone. The land was difficult. The population was small, and surrounding communities viewed the returning exiles with suspicion. The promises were large. The restored community was weak. Their first priority was worship. An altar was rebuilt, and sacrifices resumed even before the temple itself was restored. The people observed the appointed festivals and laid the foundation of a new sanctuary. When the foundation was completed, priests sounded trumpets, Levites played cymbals, and the people praised God for his enduring covenant love. But the sound rising from Jerusalem was mixed. Younger people shouted with joy because they saw a new beginning. Older people who remembered Solomon's temple wept. Some looked at the foundation and saw restoration. Others looked at it and remembered what had been lost. The celebration and the grief became indistinguishable from a distance. The restored community had returned to the land, but it could not return to the past. Opposition soon slowed the work. Local groups offered to participate, but their involvement was rejected because the returned exiles believed the responsibility had been entrusted specifically to the covenant community. The disagreement hardened into resistance. Accusations were sent to Persian officials. Political pressure increased. Construction stopped. Years passed. The people built homes for themselves while the temple remained unfinished. Then the prophets Haggai and Zechariah spoke. Haggai confronted the community for living in finished houses while the sanctuary remained neglected. He connected their economic frustration with their misplaced priorities. They planted much but harvested little. They earned wages but seemed to place them into torn bags. The return to the land had not automatically produced covenant renewal. The people needed to consider their ways. Zerubbabel, Joshua, and the community responded. Work on the temple resumed. Haggai addressed those discouraged by the building's modest appearance. Compared with Solomon's temple, the new structure seemed insignificant. But God's presence did not depend upon architectural splendor. The prophet promised that the glory associated with God's future work would exceed what the people could presently see. Zechariah received visions of restoration, cleansing, and future hope. He saw Joshua, the high priest, standing in stained garments, while an accuser stood against him. The filthy clothing was removed and replaced. The image represented guilt being taken away by divine grace. Zechariah also spoke of a figure called the Branch, a title connected with future Davidic hope. Priesthood and kingship cleansing, and rule, temple, and kingdom began to appear together within the prophetic vision. Another of Zechariah's messages declared that the restoration would not be accomplished by military strength or human power, but by the Spirit of God. Zerubbabel had begun the temple's foundation. He would help bring the work to completion. The new temple was eventually finished and dedicated. Passover was celebrated. Worship had returned to Jerusalem, but something remained unresolved. The Ark of the Covenant was not described as returning to the inner sanctuary. The Davidic king did not resume his throne. Judah remained under Persian authority. The temple stood again, but the kingdom had not been restored in its former form. The people were home, yet they were still subjects of a foreign empire. Restoration had begun, fulfillment had not. Meanwhile, many Jewish people continued to live throughout Persian territory. One of the clearest stories of the diaspora, the Jewish communities scattered outside Judah, is found in the book of Esther. In the Persian capital of Susa, King Ahasuerus removed Queen Vashti from her position. A search was conducted for a new queen, and a young Jewish woman named Esther was selected. Her cousin and guardian Mordecai instructed her not to reveal her ancestry. Esther entered the royal household carrying an identity the court did not know. Mordecai later uncovered a plot against the king. His act was recorded, but he received no immediate reward. Then a powerful official named Haman rose within the empire. When Mordecai refused to bow before him, Haman's anger expanded beyond one man. He sought the destruction of the entire Jewish population throughout the empire. A royal decree was issued, assigning a day on which the Jews could be attacked and their possessions taken. The people who had survived Babylonian exile now faced annihilation under Persia. Mordecai urged Esther to approach the king. But entering the royal presence without being summoned could result in death. Esther hesitated. Mordecai reminded her that life within the palace would not necessarily protect her. He also expressed confidence that deliverance would arise for the Jewish people, even if Esther refused. Then he raised the question that defined her moment. Perhaps she had reached her royal position for such a time as this. Esther called for fasting. Then she chose to approach the king, accepting the possibility that she might die. The king received her. Through carefully arranged banquets, Esther exposed Haman's plot and revealed her Jewish identity. Haman was executed on the instrument he had prepared for Mordecai. Because Persian decrees could not simply be reversed, another decree authorized the Jews to defend themselves. The day intended for their destruction became a day of survival and victory. The festival of Purim was established to remember the reversal. The book of Esther does not directly name God, yet the events repeatedly turn through timing, courage, reversal, and apparent coincidence. A forgotten act of loyalty is remembered at the crucial moment. A hidden identity becomes the means of deliverance. A death sentence falls upon the man who designed it for others. Even far from Jerusalem, the covenant people are preserved. The promise remains alive not because the empire is friendly, but because events beyond human control continually protect the people through whom the promise must continue. Back in Judah, another stage of restoration began under Ezra. Ezra was a priest and scribe devoted to studying, practicing, and teaching the law of God. He received Persian authorization to travel to Jerusalem with another group of exiles. The community had a rebuilt temple, but it still needed spiritual renewal. Ezra discovered that some of the returned people, including leaders, had formed marriages that threatened to draw the community back into the idolatry from which exile had been meant to turn them. The issue was not racial purity. Foreigners such as Rahab and Ruth had already been welcomed into the covenant story through faith. The concern was covenant unfaithfulness and the reintroduction of idolatrous worship. Ezra tore his garments, mourned, and confessed the sins of the community as though they were his own. His prayer reviewed Israel's pattern: divine grace, human rebellion, judgment, and mercy. The response that followed involved painful decisions and must be understood within the crisis of that particular restored community. The text does not present human relationships as trivial. It shows how desperately the returned exiles feared repeating the unfaithfulness that had led to exile. Yet even strong reform could not change the human heart completely. Jerusalem's physical condition also remained vulnerable. A Jewish official named Nehemiah served in the Persian court as cupbearer to the king. When visitors from Judah told him that Jerusalem's walls were still broken and its gates burned, Nehemiah wept, fasted, and prayed. He confessed Israel's sins and appealed to the covenant. Then he approached the king. Nehemiah requested permission to travel to Jerusalem and rebuild its defenses. Authorization was granted, along with letters and resources for the journey. When Nehemiah arrived, he inspected the walls at night before publicly announcing his plan. The work began, but opposition appeared almost immediately. Sanballat, Tobiah, Geshem, and others mocked the builders, accused Nehemiah of rebellion, and attempted to frighten the community. As threats increased, workers carried building tools while remaining prepared to defend themselves. Families were positioned near vulnerable sections of the wall. The project became both construction and watchfulness. But external opposition was not the only danger. Some wealthy Jews were exploiting poorer members of the community through loans, interest, and the seizure of land. Families were losing property, and some children had entered forms of debt service. Nehemiah confronted the nobles. A restored wall would mean little if injustice continued inside it. The wealthy agreed to return what they had taken. Nehemiah also refused many of the privileges available to a governor, attempting to model leadership that did not burden the people. The wall was completed with extraordinary speed. Israel's enemies recognized that the work had been accomplished with divine help. But rebuilding stone was easier than rebuilding faithfulness. Ezra gathered the people and the law was read publicly. Levites explained its meaning so that the community could understand. The people wept when they heard the words, recognizing how far they had fallen short. But they were also told to celebrate because the day was holy. The joy of the Lord would be their strength. The Feast of Booths was observed, reminding the people that their ancestors had lived in temporary shelters after leaving Egypt. The restored community now stood within rebuilt walls, listening to the same covenant story that had begun with deliverance from slavery. They confessed the long history of Israel's rebellion. God had chosen Abraham. He had delivered the people from Egypt. He had given the law, sustained them in the wilderness, and brought them into the land. They had repeatedly disobeyed. God had sent prophets. They had refused to listen. Foreign kingdoms had ruled over them, yet God had not abandoned them. The people renewed their commitment to the covenant. But the book of Nehemiah does not end with permanent success. After Nehemiah spent time away from Jerusalem, he returned and discovered new compromise. Temple rooms had been misused. Levites had been neglected. Sabbath practices had been ignored. Intermarriage again threatened covenant identity. Nehemiah acted forcefully to restore order. The repetition was painful. The temple had been rebuilt. The walls had been rebuilt. Public worship had been restored. The law had been taught. Still, the people drifted. The external structures of covenant life could be repaired. The human heart remained resistant. This is where the later prophetic voices became especially important. Malachi addressed a community that had grown spiritually tired. The people questioned God's love. Priests offered defective sacrifices. Marriage covenants were treated lightly. Justice appeared delayed. Some asked what benefit came from serving God. The problem was no longer dramatic worship of Baal under a violent king. It was religious indifference within a restored community. The people continued rituals while giving God what cost them little. Malachi warned that the Lord would come to his temple, but his arrival would expose and purify. A messenger would prepare the way before him. The prophet also spoke of the coming day of the Lord, a day of judgment for arrogance and wickedness, but of healing for those who feared God's name. The closing words looked back to Moses and forward to another prophetic messenger associated with Elijah. Then the Old Testament prophetic voice fell silent. The story had traveled an immense distance. Creation had begun in goodness. Humanity had rebelled in Eden. Violence had spread through the generations. The flood had judged the ancient world, yet sin had continued. The nations had gathered at Babel to make their own name. God had called Abraham and promised blessing to all families of the earth. The promise passed through Isaac, Jacob, and the tribes of Israel. Joseph's suffering preserved the family in Egypt. Egypt later enslaved them. God raised Moses, judged Pharaoh, led Israel through the sea, and established the covenant at Sinai. The people entered the land under Joshua, but repeatedly abandoned the God who had rescued them. Judges delivered them temporarily. Kings promised stability. David united the nation and received the promise of an enduring dynasty. Solomon built the temple, but his divided heart prepared the way for a divided kingdom. Israel and Judah ignored prophet after prophet. Assyria destroyed the northern kingdom. Babylon burned Jerusalem and carried Judah into exile. Persia permitted the exiles to return. The temple and walls were rebuilt, but the deeper restoration remained unfinished. Every major institution of Israel had revealed both divine purpose and human limitation. The law revealed holiness, but could not force the human heart to love God. The sacrificial system provided covenant cleansing, yet sacrifices had to be offered repeatedly. The priesthood represented the people before God, but priests themselves could become corrupt. The kingship was intended to establish justice, but kings often pursued power and idolatry. The temple testified that God desired to dwell among his people, yet the presence of a building could not protect a rebellious nation. The prophets spoke truth, but the people frequently resisted them. The exile disciplined the nation, but returning to the land did not eliminate sin. The Old Testament, therefore, ends with tension. God has remained faithful. The human problem remains. The promise has become clearer, but it is not yet fully realized. Across the law, the prophets, and the writings, several lines of hope converge. There is the promised offspring who will defeat the serpent. There is the descendant of Abraham, through whom the nations will be blessed. There is the ruler from Judah. There is the son of David, whose kingdom will endure. There is the prophet like Moses. there is the righteous branch. There is the servant who suffers for the sins of others. There is the shepherd who gathers the scattered flock. There is the Son of Man who receives an everlasting dominion. There is the messenger who prepares the way. There is the promise of a new covenant, a new heart, and the Spirit of God dwelling within His people. These images are connected, but the Old Testament does not reduce them to a single simple description. At times, the coming figure appears as a king, at times as a servant, at times as a prophet, at times as a shepherd. He will rule, yet He will suffer. He will bring justice, yet He will be rejected. He will be connected with Israel, yet His work will reach the nations. The Hebrew word Messiah means anointed one. Priests and kings could be anointed for their calling, but the accumulating promises created expectation for a uniquely faithful anointed one. He would accomplish what earlier leaders had not. Adam had failed within a garden of abundance. Israel had failed within a land of promise. Kings had failed upon the throne. Priests had failed within the sanctuary. The coming Messiah would need to remain faithful where all others had fallen. The Old Testament does not end because God's plan has failed. It ends because the next stage has not yet arrived. The people remain under foreign rule. Jerusalem has a temple, but no Davidic king. The covenant is remembered, but the promised transformation of the heart is still awaited. The nations have not yet received the fullness of Abraham's blessing. The serpent has not yet been finally defeated. Death still reigns. The prophetic horizon remains open. Generations will pass between the final Old Testament prophets and the events recorded in the New Testament. Empires will continue to rise and fall. Persia will give way to Greece. Greek power will fracture. New rulers will desecrate and contest Jerusalem. Jewish communities will struggle to preserve their identity, worship, and hope. Eventually, Rome will dominate the region, but the essential Old Testament question will remain the same. When will God fulfill His promises? The answer will not begin in a palace. It will begin with announcements of unexpected births. A priest standing in the temple, a young woman receiving an impossible message, and a child born into the house of David. But that belongs to the next part of the biblical story. The Old Testament closes at the threshold. Its covenants, failures, sacrifices, kingdoms, prophecies, and longings all point forward, not because every detail is a direct prediction, but because the entire story has created a need no ordinary human ruler can meet. Humanity needs more than another beginning. Israel needs more than another reform. The nations need more than another empire. The world needs the promised king who will confront sin without becoming corrupted by it, carry the covenant without breaking it, suffer without being defeated, and establish a kingdom that will not pass away. From creation to exile, from exile to restoration, God's purpose has endured through every human failure. The garden was lost, the flood came, the tower fell, the patriarchs struggled, the wilderness generation rebelled, the kingdom divided, the temple burned, the people entered exile. Yet the promise continued. The Old Testament ends with no human hero able to complete the story. Abraham is dead. Moses is buried outside the land. David's throne is empty. The prophets are silent. But God has not forgotten His word. The story waits for the Messiah. If this journey helped you understand the Old Testament as one complete story, subscribe and continue with us into the New Testament the moment the long-awaited promise begins to unfold.